Hey, this is Aaron, and it's the show Deadhead Animation. Oh, I'm not even on Deadhead Animation anymore. Okay, sorry. Good thing that people are just shuffling in. Okay, so, hi, I'm Aaron, and I'm from the show Re-Education, and today we're going to be hosting a debate between Esoteric the Free and Radical Reviewer. So, and we're also going to have a sub-in by someone named the Filthy Heretic, who's also another fantastic YouTuber, and we're going to go through exactly who they are. Oh, can anybody hear what I'm saying? Hopefully you can hear what I'm saying now, because I don't think that you could hear what I was saying a second ago.
I can hear what you're saying.
Okay.
I have the audio on the stream right now, and it's just so weird.
Is it just me like moving around and not actually saying anything? Because I imagine that's probably what's going
No, you're
on.
saying stuff.
Oh, am I really? Okay. Yeah. So I'm having a few technical difficulties with this.
You have a slight echo. It's sort of like you know how it sounds like when you got feedback.
Oh, okay. Really? There's a slight echo. All right. I'll see if I can fix the echo. But until then. Oh, it is better now? Okay, good. All right, so like I said, my name is Aaron. This is the show Re-Education, and today we're going to be hosting a review between Esoteric the Free and Radical Reviewer with a sub-in also from Filthy Heretic. And why don't we go through and explain who exactly you guys are, starting with Esoteric. Please give us a description of your channel and what exactly you do.
Alright, so my channel used to be referred to as Esoteric the Free. I am Esoteric the Free, just I prefer ESO because it's a lot less autistic and it's a lot easier to say. That's just sort of what people gravitate towards anyway. But anyway, the channel that I host now is shared between myself and Filthy Heretic, and it's referred to as Back Alley Philosophy. I formerly I formerly would have considered myself an anarcho-capitalist, but I have developed some sort of contentious views with mainstream Austro-libertarianism and the sort of approximation of a free market, which a lot of them have developed through their rather inconsistent application of Austrian methodology. So, even though I find the term capitalism to be a contentious term, I would consider myself a left market anarchist or free market anti-capitalist, because that's sort of general approximation of where my views would sit in terms of actually what I espouse. And man, I'm just hearing myself talk right now, and I'm saying a lot. So I apologize to all the viewers in advance if that gets annoying.
Okay, just hang on 1 second, because we are getting a massive amount of echoing, and it is coming from my
Do you have
my
the
side.
stream open on another tab?
No, I don't have the stream open on another tab. It's actually going through my audio and then playing through the microphone. So I just have to set up a pair of headphones here for a second. So just give me 1 second here.
All right.
Suppose I could go on a bit longer. Some of the authors that inspired this sort of view. Mainly, the reason why I changed my views was, for one, I became a lot more interested in sort of how people convey information and how it's internalized. Whereas previously, as I'm sure plenty of people who are watching the stream that were actually familiar with my content, when I started up, would know I came in with a rather cringy SJW gets pwned XDDD Ben Shapiro wrecked mentality. And yeah, now I find myself actually more interested in philosophical concepts and sort of the discussion of narratives, and that's led me to finding the social question to be very important. And I found this mainly through people like Benjamin Tucker, Roderick Long, Lysander Spooner, a lot of these sort of individualist anarchists, which don't get discussed a lot in the sort of bread tube circles, but I think that they're important. for actually understanding in greater detail a lot of these positions, and I think that they'd be important for anyone to read, considering that they provide probably the more substantive arguments for individualist anarchism, more so than even like Murray Rothbard, or if you even want to call him an individualist.
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay,
The echo's
perfect.
fixed.
Okay, I'm glad that I could I could provide some some content while people were figuring this stuff out.
Great work.
Okay, so go ahead, Radical Reviewer. You tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, yeah, I'm the Radical Reviewer. I've been reviewing mostly books and occasionally movies and other stuff here on YouTube for like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 or 6 years now. Um, I take my sort of political philosophy, whatever leanings from authors like Alexander Berkman, who did the ABCs of Anarchism or What is Anarcho Communism. I am an anarcho communist myself. I also like David Harvey, who is a modern Marxist author. Kropotkin, of course, in the Bread Book. Michael Albert, who's been on stuff recently, did a debate with Destiny and was on the Surfs live stream. I like Michael Albert a lot. Um, and that's sort of where I get my, um, you know, outside of real life experience, where I sort of get my political, sociological understanding of the world. That's what I'm about.
Okay, perfect. So, and also, Filthy Heretic, tell us a little bit about yourself as well, please.
Sorry about that. Oh, hi. I'm the Heretic. So, I kind of have an interesting journey in the sense that, I mean, this is before I started making content. I used to be a conservative, and then I started becoming anarchist. I was kind of in the same boat as Esso not long or a few years ago, where I started making content as someone who identified as an anarcho-capitalist, but as my views kind of shifted, I came to understand what the radical rational humility that anarchism implies necessarily means that, well, there isn't going to be any one economic system that people are going to gravitate around. And although you could make the argument that one economic system is going to be more efficient than the other, that there are multiple values and that how people are going to produce and distribute scarce resources is going to end up being completely different from one another and parallel to each other. With this in mind, well, I've kind of dropped the anarcho capitalist label. I mean, sure, every now and then, like, I might identify with that term, but overall, I think the best way to describe me is an anarchist without adjectives. As long as all participants voluntarily consent, it's no concern of mine how they do it.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go through the very first topic here, and that is
How about
basically.
yourself, Aaron?
Oh. Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So now, okay, so.
And we lost him again.
Yeah, no. So I have it on push to talk. So if I push spacebar, it'll mute me on one thing and let me talk on the other thing. I'm not very good at this. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit first about remuneration, which is basically how you get paid, that sort of thing. And we're going to start off first with Esso, and I want you to talk a little bit about what you think of remuneration, how you think it should be gone about. And then we'll talk to Radical Reviewer and hear his counterpoints.
All right. Well, first thing that I want to establish is a very unfortunate socially dysgenic effect that is sort of overtaken most societies on Earth. Is the conflation of material interests and sort of philosophical, external, ethical views about society. And that is particularly what makes discussion about this topic so difficult, because a lot of people will internalize someone challenging their economic arguments as a challenge to their interests, and people associate with views about associating economically with their own material interests, and sort of try and project that onto the broader society, because the way that they think of meeting their own interests, or the way that they've conceptualized how you meet your interests, is you have to associate through the state, and the state will implement these sort of policy plans which will engineer society around these particular marginal traits. And my view is more along the lines of Filthy Heretic, and that's one of the main reasons why I think a freed market um, would not really gravitate around any sort of central economic model. So I guess I'll get that out of the way first. If you were planning on debating an economic model per se, I don't necessarily have a view on economic models. I have views on models of association which I think are more beneficial for me and which are generally more efficient, but I don't think that a broader society has an economic model. I don't think that these sort of systems exist in nature. In fact, the idea of a system of social organization itself runs into conflict with human action, because that would imply that there exist structures separate from people organizing in pursuit of their own mutual interests, that would sort of engineer the direction people sort of tends to organize in pursuit of, even if it's not beneficial to themselves. I think it's a lot more reasonable to argue that these sort of economic systems exist because of state limitations and effects caused by state interference into the market through finance manipulation, regulatory capture, and subsidy for big business. So I think that it doesn't. If you're going to really, like, I suppose I would ask, like, let's specify what we mean by remuneration, and what exactly we're debating here, because I'm very much the kind of person where, if for whatever reason I found, a mutual aid society for one industry to be more beneficial to me than an organization which is sort of organized under the traditional profit incentive, I wouldn't have any objection to associating with such a firm. And there have been multiple firms, even in the current political economy, which were very successful for certain industries, which organized under that sort of model. The Cincinnati Times store being an example, fraternal societies throughout the mid to late 19th century being another example in term for the healthcare market. So I yeah, fucking hell. Is there a language limit for the stream, or like are we allowed to just say whatever?
Like content warning.
Yeah, no, there you can
languages?
go ahead and say whatever you want. Just try to stick away from, like, as far as cursing and stuff like that goes, I don't really mind. But as far as like slurs and that sort of thing, just definitely don't say any of those.
I wasn't gonna use any slurs, obviously, but I suppose I just I don't know. I feel like I've sort of rambled a bit, but yeah, I suppose back to one of you guys. What exactly are you discussing about remuneration? Like, what exactly is your point of contention with everything that I've proposed?
Yeah, so radical reviewer, why don't
There,
you go
which
ahead
is
and address his question there, and maybe if somebody could lay down basically an idea of what you're talking about with remuneration, if it's radical reviewer or if it's ESO, just give us a definition so then we can work off of that and not stray too far from it.
Well, I know the definition. It's just more. Are you trying to discuss what system you or what model of organization you think is more efficient? Or are you trying to discuss ethical issues with one over another?
I mean, for me, I suppose it's a combination of I would obviously propose that my idea of how remuneration should be handled in society is both ethically the better option, and then also just more effective in regards to my values and the way that people operate in society. But I suppose I can kind of riff on what was said so far, if that's copacetic with everybody.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I feel like the free association thing I agree with and like in a lot of ways. Obviously, like as an anarchist and otherwise, but it leads to problems with what people typically call like the social contract, right? If you're benefiting from being a member of society where there's um, services available for you, schools that you can go to, electricity going to your house, water going to your house and stuff, then you're interacting with like, your community in to the extent that you are operating as a member of a larger whole in society. So then we must decide, okay, if you're contributing to this larger whole, what portion of what you contribute do you get back? And when it comes to remuneration in the communist sense, a lot of folks, this was like on a Joe Rogan made this mistake. Stefan Molyneux made this mistake referring to the equality of outcomes, which isn't typically what people refer to. Cuck Philosophy, which is a great YouTube channel, and Anarcho-Pack, which is another great YouTube channel, have both discussed Marx's stance on equality of outcome, and that he doesn't promote equality of outcome. He says, to each according to ability for each according to need. And Kropotkin reversed that, saying we should address needs first. But we all understand that we have varying degrees of need and we have varying degrees of ability. So I just think that if I'm existing in a society, in a social system, I'm obviously going to benefit. I'm going to have a safer, more desirable livelihood if the people around me have some sense of self-management, that they're able to uh, contribute to the economy and the greater society in a more democratic way, rather than using economic systems which have all sorts of uh, problems. Market systems and capitalist systems have all sorts of problems, like Marx talks about um, the means of production having power over the workers, that when you come to the free market of exchange and you're there to try and not starve to death, and a company is coming there looking for any worker, that's not a very equal exchange. An example that Ben Burgess gave in his uh, arguments for the left book was that, if you're a starving person and someone off requests sexual favors in exchange for food, well, that's not really consenting to the sexual favors, right? So we have to look at power imbalances, and the way to do that would probably be some sort of democratic self-management, as opposed to some kind of market exchange.
Okay,
Okay,
perfect.
so
So it
did you?
sounds like you guys kind of have an idea of what you're talking about when it comes to remuneration. Eso, what do you have to basically say to that?
So first thing that I have to say in response, you use the term social contract to describe um someone's sort of access to resources in society, or the availability of resources. I don't think that that's I guess I would have to ask you to clarify what you mean by that, because colloquially that term has an entirely different meaning, one that I'm sure we'll be going over later in the debate. But that is sort of what I was referring to earlier, a lot of these problems, and this is sort of the problem in general with the Marxist critique, I would argue. It's Marx seems to identify something which is rather correct in an abstract sense, in that there are sort of problems that exist in society and problems which are structural. I would just argue that his explanation of how these sort of structures exist, that is, and why they exist and what causes them, I would say, is misdirected. And it seems that he sort of developed an abstract sense of his conclusion first, and then worked backwards to try and explain it. And that's sort of evidenced with this idea, again, that systems exist in nature. I guess I'll go back to my sort of previous criticism, but also, refer back to my previous criticism of the idea that sort of systems divorced from human action exist in nature, but also this sort of abstraction of the political economy as it exists and market standards coming into being because they're just sort of being reinforced that way, to be that way by the people who are running the sort of the firms which dominate industry. It seems very much like that the explanation was an afterthought, because there's not really, I haven't seen at least a very cohesive explanation of how that comes in, of how that is, or if there is a cohesive explanation. Mark, which anybody can provide. It's almost always factors which are caused by the state, and that's just sort of glossed over. Like I mentioned earlier, the degree to which the state controls the finance industry in most countries is remarkable. I mean, and that's almost never addressed, or at the very least, people point, the sort of Marxian crowd, they'll point to these sort of international finance cartels like the IMF or the World Bank, which are multinational, state established sort of NGO organizations which have significant political power, and those are ascribed to be market forces. But no, if you look at a lot of these usury restrictions, if you look at a lot of the ways in which the government, through organizations like the FDIC, is able to manipulate credit and how people obtain finances due to abstract things such as simply what political beliefs the producer has, or other organizations they've associated with, or what models they organize their firm around. I mean, that becomes the main, thing that we can point to, which suggests, this sort of this dominating model of business hierarchy. It seems like that has come into being for a lot of these industries, even where it's clearly not beneficial to the consumer, more as a result of state privilege or regulatory capture, and these firms merely trying to compensate for the costs and the avenues of these tight avenues of access to these resources they have to navigate through in order to obtain financing. Seems like that's more the main problem, instead of market forces. Aside from that, we can get into other actual problems with this, which exist when it comes to discussing how the market functions, such as diseconomy of scale being a great example, where firms simply can't scale up naturally to the size that we're seeing them in the political economy, because they begin to internalize greater costs than they're able to profit because of the amount of resources they have to manage and the amount of actual cost it takes to manage them. And information begins to, the more that a firm scales up, the more difficult it becomes for a firm to actually manage all the information they have to in order to efficiently calculate resources. So they begin to actually operate at a loss simply because of the size that they are functioning on. And, a lot of people, particularly from the sort of lefty economic persuasion, so to speak, point to would be economies of scale. Well, economies of scale, for being a justification as to how sort of large domineering firms and models could occupy a society or a small area. Well, those can come into being, but those also inevitably lead to diseconomies of scale. Say, for instance, you have a firm or two which ends up dominating a local economy, a town of 1,000, 2,000 people, and it obtains 90 to 95% of the market share there. Well, then the only market that they really can tap into would be markets they have to travel to, and in order to actually, give more of their resources out to other markets, they have to end up spending more on distributing resources, which ends up leading to them internalizing greater costs. So, do I think that the business structure as it exists is something that exists out of natural reinforcement? No, I think actually that it's more of that it's that the political economy itself, as it's sort of structured, is the end result of state coercion and manipulation. Uh, do I think that there is really, a case for, I sorry, I'm getting caught up in my thought process, but I think actually we agree fundamentally that because people individually are the ones who are making economic decisions or market transactions, and it's people individually who are pursuing their own interests, that people, just individual market actors, ought to be the main ones who are actually engaging in trade, and everything ought to occur on sort of as local of a level as possible. But another point, and we could probably discuss this later, is I don't think democracy or any sort of centralized model or planned model is a means to attain this. In fact, I would say it's actually the opposite. Um, Sort of individuals exclusively owning the resources that they've produced or have obtained through trade, that is the most radical form of decentralization which could exist. Gone on for a while, so I guess I'll stop here to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, so you made a couple of interesting comments here, specifically on the economies of scale, saying something along the lines that companies can't grow larger because the more they grow, the more that they have to take on, the more difficult it is. Is that basically what one of the arguments you were making there was?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a factor of diseconomies of scale, but another that I mentioned is firms which have more resources have a more difficult time internalizing information and using that information to efficiently calculate how they distribute resources, and that leads to mismanagement. I think everybody who's actually worked for one of these sort of Fortune 500 or 1,000 companies on the sort of floor actually sort of the entry level position, like a Walmart or whatever. Everybody has seen this firsthand. They've been given orders by a manager, which was immediately contradicted by another manager, and that ends up um, in time being lost or resources being, forgotten about or misplaced.
Okay, yeah, I just
And
wanted a little bit of
that's
confirmation on that. All right, so you've gone on
okay.
for a little while here, so I'm just going to switch over to Radical Reviewer. Do you have anything to say to that? I think the economies of scale comment we would probably have some problems with, but what do you think, Radical Reviewer? Tell me a little bit about what you think.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and address the first point and the last point about the social contract, and that the most decentralized form of remuneration would be what was gained through personal, work, or what was attained through trade. Which is that Kropotkin said that there is not even a thought or invention. I might misdo this quote, but there's a basic idea. There's not a thought or invention that isn't based on the innumerable inventions that came before it. So the social contract, which would tie into that, is like, okay, if we were living in tribal times, it's going to be pretty clear how reliant I am to the direct community around me for my own survival. Now that we kind of have this industrialized society, we all have our own apartments or whatever, we all spend our own money at the grocery store, our direct connection, reliance on others for survival is a little more muddied and starts to get into this atomistic territory. But I would just say that there is, no such thing as, like, if I were to take tools and go out into the woods and make a chair with those tools, well, where did I get the concept or the thought to design a chair from? Where did I get the tools from? The metal that I used came from a quarry, which was shipped somewhere, right? It's all incredibly interconnected. I was trying to find another quote that Kropotkin said, and I can't seem to stumble upon it, but the idea that you can you have this group of workers and you're supposed to proportion an amount of remuneration for this amount of time to this worker compared to that one seems like a really ludicrous way to divvy out remuneration, when obviously the way that we function is a lot more social. We work on projects as a team. Sometimes one person's working harder, sometimes another person's working harder. Sometimes people are more on the idea side, people are more on the fulfillment side. So it's sort of ignoring the social contract to try and remunerate just based on what an individual freely traded for, or what an individual produced by their own initiative, if such a thing, maybe could be measured on paper or hypothetically, but wouldn't bear out in the real world.
We're not even disagreeing on that point. In fact, that's sort of the main basis by which I'm arguing that in a sort of stateless society, in one without the sort of constructs of the state manipulating the market, that there would be not just, many more competing firms that could exist, but also different models of association, and they would all be, there would be a much smaller barrier of entry for most people, if it was even really a barrier of entry significant enough to call it as such to begin with. But as to what I was going to say about Kropotkin, I think that you're conflating two different conceptions of property, that of being actual property, something which is obtained either through voluntary interactions with other people or made by a person or organization, and sort of intellectual property or copyright, which is neither of us would argue is a legitimate form of property. It's a product of state privilege, and it's always been exercised as such. The difference, of course, between those two concepts is, for one thing, with actual tangible property, the resources which were used to create that, and the interactions which were used to obtain that, sort of exclusively belong to the people who are involved in that association. And you run into problems with when it comes to copyright, where it's difficult to actually prove ownership of an idea. You can't really prove, you can maybe claim credit for an idea, but if someone were to use their resources in order to create something which, was a rough approximation of your idea,
Would you
it,
say that when it comes to intellectual property, like all art is derivative kind of thing, right? Like you couldn't really say what any one person's input was to
yeah, well,
one
that's
intellectual property.
yeah, sure. That's sort of the main problem that I was getting to. Is also, there's not even really a cohesive way to prove that the ideas were even conceived of in the same way, or that if even if you have a similar idea, it was intended to function for the same purpose, or you even knew about the other person who created um, the idea. But sort of what I was getting to as well is, if I used my resources to create something and someone else happened to have the idea, well, for one thing, I'm not taking anything from them, so you can't really argue that it's an act of aggression on the grounds that it's theft, because there's nothing, like I just noted, there's not actually any resource that was owned by them or belonged to them, which is being taken from them. But then there's the other problem, which you just mentioned as well. How do you actually prove that that was your idea? So, and that is actually, a valid criticism, I would say, if applied to intellectual property. And that specific argument proposed by Kropotkin, I would actually say, is a example of a valid concept, made by a valid analysis made by Kropotkin. But yeah, even most individualists, hell, even most colloquial Austro-libertarians don't recognize intellectual property as a form of property. In fact, most arguments against state privilege incorporate criticisms of copyright law and point to copyright law as a monopoly privilege
Well,
granted.
hang on. So I would just extend this outward, right? So property, like the earth itself, might be one question, but whatever we make from like the fruits of the earth, I would apply the same mindset that I would apply to intellectual property, that there's not really any concrete way to say who did. You could look at like who did an who input into the creation of this intellectual property, but it's hard to calculate any amount because it was socially created. And I would just extend that outward to looking around the room here. This dresser, okay, well, like the wood came from somewhere, but the tools, the metal, the wood itself, the design was invented, socially. The people who
Yeah,
came up with the
see what I
concept, it
mean?
was invented socially.
This is exactly what I was talking about when I opened up, which is, now you're starting to get into the ethical side of property relations, which is a separate question from remuneration. And this is, you're not doing anything wrong. It's a valid question, and we can get into that. I mean, I just, presumably we're still discussing remuneration or remuneration, however you want to pronounce that. But yeah, it's very difficult to separate those two things in how discourse exists among political affiliations today.
If I
Yeah.
can interject here for just 1 second. So, as far as
Yeah.
remuneration goes, like if it goes into an area where people's emotions or whatever feelings on the matter come into addressing it, then I think that also has to play into it as well, because we don't live in a vacuum where everything just happens regardless of human beings' behavior. It's just all analytical and stuff like that. You have to actually take into consideration the way people feel about things and the way people respond. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't feel like that's an off-topic subject.
Well, property relations are an entirely ethical construct, and yeah, I'm sure they a society which is either centralized and uses legislative fiat to incentivize people to operate in one way with their property may be different from another in terms of actually um, what the remuneration in the political economy for said society will look like. But yeah, that those are two entirely different things. I would argue. But yeah, I mean, Filthy Heretic just said in the chat that if we're sort of getting to the end of where we can continue talking about this, where it doesn't where it is no longer a question of remuneration and becomes a question of property ethics, and we can get into the ethical debate, which we were planning on.
Yeah, that's true. So, and I do think that they do tie into one another. So, since we've talked quite a bit about remuneration, why don't we just?
I did want a clarification just
Go ahead.
for this subject, and I guess for the discussion as a whole, is because you folks, I assume both of you have kind of backed off of capitalism as a system to itself, but are pro market economies, just market economies in general, just not capitalist markets. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not. I'm just going to answer this for myself. I'm not even sure what a good capitalism means, since, as Roger Long pointed out, it's often used to describe incredibly contradictory ideas. The term he used was that it capitalism is defined as a free market like the one we have in the United States today. And of course, I think we can all understand that that is an anti-concept because, well, we don't have a free market in the United States today. And that's going to be largely the problem of, well, the term capitalism. But what we do support is, I mean, it's not really support, it's just so much of it's a preference of ours that we would like a market economy. But I think we said early on that ultimately our preference for market economy is a preference and not really a principle, because
That's fine.
there's going to be maybe sort of. Sorry, continue.
He was just saying that's fine. I mean, I don't know if that was an interjection or not.
My stance and why I would so my goal, and I think for you folks as well, is probably that people should have some form of self-management, right? That they should have control over their decisions. And I just feel like a market system doesn't promote that. There's the exchanges that occur under a market system are coercive. So I would promote more of a democratic way of decision making to try and avoid the coercion that is involved in like a market exchange. And that comes from either trading items or just trading in the sense of like you pay me for a service.
Trading items or trading items, that is to say bartering, or items for a service, that is just a market exchange.
Yeah, but I feel like those are coercive, right? Like I brought up the example of if you're hungry and then the exchange is, okay, well, I want you to perform these acts that you don't want to perform, and then you can have some of the food I have. Or in the way that like a worker comes to the marketplace because they're desperate for food, clothes, and shelter, where an employer comes to the marketplace and they can hire if they want to, or maybe they don't want to. They could wait a week or a month before hiring you because they have enough resources to bear that out.
Well, again, I guess I would argue that's more of a product of the political economy and not property relations or an actual freed market itself. And we can point to numerous ways where that's the case. I mean, if you were to look at, how the state suppresses sort of mutual aid organizations or charity based organizations, if you look at the way that the state manipulates finances, if you look at the way the state deliberately and pretty explicitly will discriminate against certain models of association and subsidize and protect legally firms from competition which organize in a certain way in pursuit of the state's own material interests. I would argue fundamentally that a freed market is actually the best way which we mitigate those problems, because a freed market not only would allow for more people to associate, and would allow consequently for more wealth to be generated in with most associations not being either violent or parasitic. uh, More people would also be able to produce more things in varying different in varying different ways. So I think that's not for if we want to talk about remuneration in terms of actually giving people more social autonomy. I again think that people being able to associate in pursuit of their own perceived interests with one another is the best way to achieve that goal. And the problem with a sort of uh, centralized, planned, whatever you want to call it,
Well, I'd
system.
prefer like a democratically planned system, not centrally planned, because that gets back into hierarchies, which, as anarchists, not cool with. But to have a democratically planned system would avoid the sort of hierarchies that come with exchange in a market sense.
Well, there are, from an efficiency standpoint, there are two problems with that fundamentally. We were talking before the stream about parasitic associations versus actually productive associations where both parties achieve wealth, and wealth being relative to their internal conception of profit. Uh, and I think that in sort of planned economies like that, it is not entirely possible for everybody to achieve profit from associations. And that's sort of what I was getting into earlier with hierarchical models. Rather, you say that you're against hierarchies from both an ethical standpoint and presumably a practical standpoint, but the sort of elephant in the room is that planned economies of any sort, uh, because they have to operate necessarily as a monopoly on arbitration over the societies that they occupy, they themselves are organized in a form of structural hierarchy where they propose legislative fiat, which is
Well,
designed.
let me interject with you there, because this concept of monopoly on arbitration, I like the way that Michael Albert explained this, which is like, okay, if we have this democratic economy where each person has like some sort of equitable say in their interaction with the economy, and therefore we all get to sort of share in the social product. If you don't want to associate with that, fuck off. Like you're free to go away. But to say that it's this monopoly on arbitration that we are deciding socially our collective, how we're operating things in a social system. If you don't want to be privy to that, then that's fine. The fire department, won't come to your house, and the power that's supplied by the general population won't come to your house. The water that's provided by the general population won't come to your house. So I don't see what's this big barrier to say that it's a monopoly on arbitration, that we decide things democratically when we're existing socially, if that makes sense.
So being a part of the voting minority is grounds for blacklisting from society?
No, I don't
And
think that's what he
also
was
that would
saying. I don't think
And
Danny was saying
also,
that.
I know that's not what he
Okay.
was saying, but I'm just trying to understand that that's kind of the conclusion that would lead to. That if,
Also,
if for example, the majority votes to, I don't know, let's go with something extreme, blow up your house, and you say, no, I don't want this to happen, and your house gets blown up anyway because that's the way the majority voted.
there's,
Could I just interject 1 second? Now, when it comes
Well,
to that
that,
sort of
like,
thing,
I
there are
often-
many different ways to go about setting up a democratic system, right? It isn't just direct democracy where majority rules all. There's also vote weighing. There's also ranked choice voting, that sort of thing as well.
okay, well, first of all, what I was going
the example that's often given is if you have a workplace where 20% of the workforce is black, the other 80% is white. How do you protect the rights of the black workers? Let's say they're not being getting raises as often, or they're not being getting promoted as often. How do you protect this minority? In which case you would have like dual power systems. You could have structures within the democracy isn't always just everyone gets one vote majority rules. It can often be proportioned, or you could have various systems within the system, if that makes sense.
I think that you're essentially just saying the exact same thing that we are. It's just the problem is that you've sort of like you like I the problem that I'm having here is you say that people have the right to disassociate. Uh, Presumably, that is an argument for freedom of association. So it's not actually a sort of central model over society. Rather, it's just a firm, and people can informally associate with it, and this firm would provide many resources and many commodities which people would be able to obtain. Is that sort of am I in the ballpark? Like if somebody wants the roof of their house repaired, for example, they can go to this firm and do like 5 hours of labor in return, or whatever the firm decides is the right amount of labor for someone to come over and fix the roof of their house.
Are you asking in an
I don't really
anarcho-communist
like the
situation?
desert island example that people use, but I'm gonna go ahead and use it. That if there was a group of 20 people or something deserted on an island, and a bunch of them form a society where they're building houses for each other, and they build a well or something, and you as an individual go to join them, you don't get to say like, hey, what's with this monopoly on arbitration? Like I should get to do whatever I want. Well, hey, wait a minute. We're doing this collectively where we all work together to build the well. So if you want to have access to the well, you have to work with us. If you're refusing to work with us and say, oh, I'm a rugged individual, then you can fuck off. Go dig your own well.
That's not how societies work, and that's why I wouldn't use the desert island example. And I'm just simply and sort of what I was getting to is that you respond with, okay, you can disassociate, so it's not a coercive association. There's no problem with me um, exclusively owning anything if I were to not associate with this firm. That's just that is a condition for associating with the firm in a free society. Is I don't know. You give up a percentage of your resources, or you relinquish some resources you have to the firm, and you'll receive something if you need it. The reason that I'm asking this is sort of like I've heard this from a lot of these sort of I don't know, lefty, so to speak, circles, where when they're faced with a criticism of a sort of central model or a monopoly on arbitration, the problems that come with a sort of direct democracy, as Aaron put it, or the problems with really any sort of democratic model, where that would imply that sure, you're free to associate with it, but that also means the firm can that means the organization in question would be able to coerce you, and would also you wouldn't be free to disassociate from the sort of legislative fiat which is being forcibly imposed onto people. I'm just asking you to clarify, so that is not you do not want a society where every single organization is sort of democratically organized, or is organized under sort of central planned models, or planned models, whatever you want to call it.
The choice would be what other options you have. What I'd said before, the example that is often given is you have a workforce with 20% of the workforce is black, 80% of it is white, and okay, if we had everything democratic, well, wouldn't there be some inequality there? And there's obviously all kinds of other democratic structures that can be put in place to avoid that. However, what's the current system is like, you have, out of that 20/80, the chances that one of the bosses is white and has more say, well, now you have hierarchical input anyway. I prefer that folks have the power of self-management, and what gives us the most power of self-management seems to be some form of democratic decision making with the systems that we engage with, as opposed to like what I would call our current system is like fascist, right? Like, I didn't vote for my manager, he was like appointed by someone above him, who was appointed by someone above him.
I would describe it as a sort of crypto mercantilist model, what we have, where you de facto have a guild system, and you have sort of royal charters granted by the state, which sort of determine how people associate in business firms throughout the society. And the consumer input is almost never, like, it's almost inconsequential. It's pretty awful. I think we all can agree. But getting back to sort of the point which I was the 2 points I was attempting to establish, the point that I was getting to with sort of the last subject I was driving at is, typically I hear a sort of a flip flop between those two positions. You want a sort of planned society. You want a planned society where everything is organized democratically, but if someone wants to disassociate, then they're free to do so. So I'm just clarifying. You do actually argue for self ownership and exclusive ownership of individual resources. You just want to establish firms within a freed market which organize democratically. Or is that not the case? And you're saying that there should be something compelling societies to establish these sort of democratic organizations where every town or whatever it has to have some sort of democratic organization. And what I'm driving at is, it seems like you get into a bunch of weird implications with this argument. Like, what is a society, for example? Is a society a couple of friends organizing with one another, or is a society a couple thousand people, couple hundred people? Like,
Could I address that really quickly, actually? Because I actually want to address that just really quickly. Okay, so when you're asking about how would a society function, right? Would it be democratic? Would it be an organization of a small amount of people? Would it be a large amount of people?
I'm not asking how society would function. I'm asking, what is a society? Because the sort of implication which that possible conclusion may drive at is
Sure, like
your
you can ask what a society is, right? But that has many different definitions, and basically a society is based on our interactions among people. So those interactions are going to be different whether or not it is in a business sense, if it is in a personal sense, if it's in a geographic location sense, if it's on online sense. So when you're talking about a society, what does a society look like? How do you organize that society? All of those factors have to be taken into consideration, right? So when you're talking about a single individual, do they get to own their own property? Well, sure, personal property, why not? But as soon as they start to accumulate more property and they want to, say, hire people, then we would end up having a problem. It all has to do with that social contract that Radical Reviewer was talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, and we are presumably going to go over that. So there is so the problem that would create then is that there would have to be a sort of central organization issuing legislative fiat. Now,
Not
whether or not
necessarily.
well, it could be democratic legislative fiat, whatever the sort of organization, is using as a tool to justify its legislative fiat, whatever. The point is, though, is
But you're
that
assuming
you,
hold on.
you
So
run in.
just for one second here, because I want to address that point before you move forward. You're assuming that we're working off of the basis that there is a centralized, organized body that is taking control of all of these different things, but that's not
Well,
how anarchism works.
there would have to be, otherwise, what stops me from organizing in a model that you would have a problem with?
So the problem with that is that it, like I said a moment ago, there are different societies that you're going to have in different sorts of genres, right? You're going to have a different society for the online sphere than you would for a geographic sphere. Those don't necessarily have to overlap, though they could in certain instances. But you don't need to have a centralized government taking control of each one of those individual outlets. You can have different organizational bodies taking care of each individual one of those problems. And then if you need to have, say, a centralized governing state that does some sort of thing like control a military, you could have that too. It all depends on if that hierarchy is justified. But really, I would like to let Radical Reviewer talk for a little bit here, because you have kind of talked for a little while.
Earlier on, but
Well, so what
I
I
don't know.
wanted to say, and I
feel
just have
like I haven't been able to respond to a single point on this question of ethics. I feel like every time I try and respond, like, for example, how any sort of democratic organization has to have legislative fiat, which would make it more centralized, actually, than you tend to frame it as.
how would it be
I
more centralized if everyone's input is more or less, equal to, their
because
the
in
degree
a
they're affected?
because in an organization or an interaction where everyone has to go through a sort of a central body and vote in order to have some sort
But it's
of
not a central body. It's the body is everyone. If it's a democratic workforce, everyone who's in the workforce is voting. The central body is all of them.
there's a central body. You just said that there's a central body. A democratic, like, this is sort of what I was getting to with frame in the beginning with framing. Democratic organizations, they're framed as if it is every single person creating an input, but where are they creating an input to? Well, they're creating an input to a sort of central organization which is going to make decisions, so as you mentioned earlier, a sort of planned economy. And that is not really the same thing as individuals meeting their own interests. That's individuals going through a big central firm in order to have one action met or one interest pursued. And that's what I mean. That's the same structural problem fundamentally with a hierarchical model. It's just that instead of a group of managers or one person making all these decisions, it is a council, or it is a group. It is a group attempting to represent the interests, quote unquote, of the people who are making these votes or these inputs, and that's going to create, the problem, of course, that we have right now of policy plans where you have uh, certain models of organization. You have people associating within certain models of organization who simply see the organization that they're associating with as a tool to have their interests met. Now, this may not be the case nearly as bad as it in an anarchy as it is in a state society where everybody is forced to associate with the state, and and consequently there is a blurred line between material interests and philosophy and ethical concerns, which yeah, that creates a sort of there's that creates a sort of blurred distinction between what is a I'm sorry, I'm going on for again, but just what I was going to say is if it's people associating with other people in pursuit of uh their own interest, exchanging their own resources for other resources, um then there's an actual productive wealth based exchange occurring there, whereas in a democracy, there are people it's an entirely parasitic association. So there's because for one thing, most associations would not be mutually beneficial for every person. They would be sort of centrally imposed by one organization. And the fact of the matter is that whether or not people vote for these sort of central policy plans is kind of irrelevant, even if it is an association that you aren't compelled to associate with. That just makes it an innately inefficient model, because that means only so much information can be communicated, and only so many associations can potentially happen, and there necessarily going to be many people who associate who are explicitly discriminated against or disadvantaged by such an organization.
Okay, so I'm
But
sorry,
Movie theater, right?
Esoteric. I'm gonna have to jump in here. I'm gonna give you guys 3 seconds to respond each time, or 3 seconds, 3 minutes to respond each time, just so we don't gish gallop. And now
okay,
your 3 minutes is pretty much over, so I'm gonna bring it over to Radical Reviewer now because I know he wants to talk.
that would be great, because I find myself, even to me it seems like I'm going on trying to respond to too many things. And Filthy, you're not even like jumping in at all.
Okay, Radical
I'll
Reviewer.
say
feel
what I
free.
said. I'll
To
say what I
jump in
said in the
more.
chat. You mind if I just say something real quick? This conversation is impossible for me to follow. I'm not checking me in because I have no idea what to friggin' say. It's going all over the place. Everybody's talking over each other, and Esso, you're gish galloping like crazy.
Oof.
Like crazy. You talked like 60% of this entire conversation. I'm sorry, but it's exacerbating.
Okay, let's go to
Fair
Radical
enough.
Reviewer. All right, Radical,
So
tell me what you want to say.
Well, first off, on this idea that, okay, if people are making a decision democratically, then it's still a centrally planned thing. It's just central to what the group voted on. But I mean, if you've gone to like the movies with a group of friends and you all get together and decide which movie to see, is that like a centrally imposed, a monopoly on arbitration decision on what movie you're all going to see, and like people are banned from trying to go see some other movie if they want? That's not exactly how decision making works in a social system. The way that Michael Albert often talks about it is that we should have a say in decision making in proportion to the degree that we're affected. So like some stuff will be one person's sole dictatorial decision. What pair of pants or shirt you decide to wear that day isn't really going to have a heavy impact on other people in a workplace. But if what you're going to wear is, I don't know, polyester, and someone at the workplace is allergic to polyester, well, now all of a sudden, it makes sense for some level of democratic decision making that person's say should matter in that situation, and it shouldn't just be that we're all either deciding dictatorially, or that we can well, I'm freely associating with this workplace. If you don't like polyester, you have to leave. Well, if we're all working together to create something, then the proportional say per person involved in the situation, they should all have a say democratically, in proportion of the degree that they're affected.
Okay, are you done?
That's it.
I don't want to. Yeah, I'm gonna try not to go on as long as I have been. But yeah. So what it sounds like to me that you're describing again is consensus, which is dodging. That's, or I don't know if dodging the question would be the right way to put it, because that implies malice, and I don't think that it is malicious, but there's a difference between consensus and democracy. Consensus is sort of exactly as you described it, where it's not even really a model of association. It's just sort of what people do when they're socializing, and there is a finite amount of resources, and it's not really a trade. One person is okay with letting other people use their resources, or whatever. The difference, though, is fundamentally in that a democracy, as I was sort of touching upon earlier, that you didn't really do anything to answer my criticisms, just from a practical perspective. I'm not even really talking about the ethical problems right now. I'm arguing fundamentally that you're saying that a democratic model of organization is one where everyone can have their own input, and I'm saying no. Fundamentally, a democratic organization is a central model where people are creating their own sort of inputs that organization claims, or I'm not even really saying that it doesn't. I'm just saying, even if the organization did take everyone's input uh, and created a sort of one model which they were going to organize around based on the majority input. What I'm saying is, because of that, you're going to have people of marginal preferences. You're going to have certain marginal preferences which are disadvantaged over others. You're going to have a limit on the amount of information which can be communicated through that organization, and it has a disadvantage which even the sort of business hierarchy we're seeing now doesn't, where it fundamentally it is limited by the amount of information that it can use, or the amount of autonomy that it would have to use its resources based on the inputs of based on the sort of perspective of the people who are creating the inputs. Now, with business hierarchies, uh, that problem still exists. It's just that in a democratic system, there's uh, no sort of cohesive organization which is going on. So everything is just sort of scattered, and there's not really
Okay. Yeah.
a conception they're operating
Sorry.
around.
So
Yeah,
you made a bunch
that was the end of what I had to say. So
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So you made a bunch of major points. The one that I would like to know more about, if Radical Reviewer wants to discuss it, though he can discuss anything he wants, is that you said democracy is by definition centrally or would have to be a central body. That I think is a fallacy. But Radical Reviewer, please tell me what you have to say.
Yeah, so something that might make this a little bit easier is some sort of referring to concrete examples. So I had worked with a friend who painted houses. He'd been painting houses for like 40 years. This wasn't like democratic. I didn't have any kind of equal say in the situation. However, it was a social interaction for me to work with this other person painting houses. And the rules of engaging in that situation were you bring a putty knife and you bring stuff you don't mind getting paint on, and like the rest of the tools will be provided as part of the business. So I wouldn't say that that's like centrally coercive entity in this very like negative way, right? Like that's just part of joining that organization. Part of participating socially in that organization is there's an expectation to bring a putty knife. There's an expectation that you're going to get paint on you. So it's not, and I wouldn't say that that's uh, negative. There's nothing negative about that. If you want to engage in something socially, then you have to meet the expectations of what that social interaction is. If I start a democratically, totally anarcho-communist commune of some kind, then you have to, whatever was the democratically established rules of engaging with that social system, you would have to abide by. Otherwise, you would be kicked out. I don't really see any problem with that. It's certainly a lot more allowing for input than something like a current capitalist system, like a grocery store that you would work for, where the manager would have basically full say as long as they're operating within the law, which is a little bit of a democratic say. That's all I got.
Okay, well, first of all, Aaron presented my position as arguing that all democratic organizations are central and well, he said centralized, but he was implying they were central bodies which had sort of hegemony over society. Is that sort of your idea of what I was arguing? Because that's not what I argued. I mean,
So
there are
what you basically said was democracy is central by definition, which was essentially what you had said, but maybe I misunderstood you.
Okay, well, I'm not saying that a
Would be helpful.
democratic organization it has central influence over society. There are co-ops which exist now. What I'm saying is that as a model of organization, uh, to argue that democratic organization is somehow able to utilize more information, even if it is inputting more information than business hierarchies, is fundamentally wrong. It's still a hierarchical model of organization because it's only able to because democracies are only able to operate around one course of action, and they're only able to impose policies based on one single vote. And I would argue that that creates the sort of the same inefficiencies that business hierarchies in the political economy right now suffer from.
I don't think that that's true. You can have proportional representation. You could have like liquid democratic systems for decision making. There's a lot of variety when it comes to how to make
I just
decisions as a group that aren't hierarchical in nature.
Yeah, and I'm not even disagreeing. I'm just saying what I'm saying is that conceptually, what a sort of democratic organization aims to do is to create a course of action based on all these inputs, a one course of action taken by the firm in question. And what I'm saying is that it really almost doesn't matter what kind of democracy it is. The problem is that the inputs that a democratic model can work with are going to be limited, and there's going to be a discrimination against certain marginal preferences, uh, that other models, such as speculative networking, at to create sort of self-employment or self-employment in general, wouldn't suffer from.
Okay, so it looks like we've covered a whole lot of remuneration, a whole lot of other topics as well in and along that. So I'm going to, unless anybody else has anything to say about that topic, I want to switch gears and I want to talk more about the left-right dichotomy and philosophical framing narratives. So does anybody else have to say anything on the previous subject before we move on?
Yeah, one thing that
I'm good
I
on it, I
almost
guess.
yeah, one thing that I was trying to cover in the beginning, but I wouldn't say I got talked over, but yeah, that sort of got brushed along is the criticism of the sort of the social contract argument. Well, the problem fundamentally with a social contract, and I think this has sort of been I've noticed this sort of um, this argument where you assume that my perspective is that of an atomist, and no, I and
That
most
direction.
I would say if not all individualists recognize that social organization is important. In fact, it's been implied in my argument that because we there are so many different perspectives and there are so many different ways to profit and marginal interest people can operate around, that it's important for people to operate with their own resources with other people within mutually beneficial exchanges. That's not something fundamentally we're disagreeing with. I just don't. I would just argue fundamentally that a democracy is not how is actually contrary to that goal. Now, ethically speaking, the problem with the social contract argument, I think, has
Social
just been
system, then you should have some say in within that social system, and that say should be distributed in some sort of democratic function.
okay. Well, the ethical problems with that aside is that fundamentally, that argument would make me a subject again to another group if I were not allowed to disassociate. Now that doesn't seem to be a problem because you guys have argued that in your ideal society, people would be able to disassociate, and that these democratic organizations would almost just be competing firms. Am I right to characterize that? To characterize these organizations in that manner?
I mean, like that's not necessarily wrong. I guess it's a fair assessment. Yeah.
Right.
I don't want to get too small with it. So let's just like hypothetically two towns, each town has like a lumber yard. If this town is democratic and working at the lumber yard is democratic and you're refusing to participate in that democratic structure, you don't get to have access to the lumber. Now, if this other town with their lumber mill operates in a different fashion, sure, whatever. Like more power to them. I just feel like the democratic situation would have more options for self-management and self-determination, and so I would prefer that method. But if you don't want to associate with that, then fuck
Yeah.
off. Go
And the
get
other
your
thing
wood
too
somewhere
is
else.
that you brought up the idea of it being like different firms competing against one another. In an anarcho-communist structured society, it's not necessarily as though there are firms competing against one another. It's just like, let's say that you need wood, right? So there are people that create or that cut down trees and create stuff to make into wood products or whatever it is. Or you need shoes, so there are people that work in shoe factories and they create the shoes. It's not necessarily like firms competing against one another. It's all about cooperating so the society works together as a whole, right? Like if you wanted to create a different business that made a better brand of shoe, you could definitely do that, and there would be a certain amount of competition, heavy scare quotes on that. But for the most part, it's a matter of making things that the people want and working in that society so they get the things that they want.
Okay, and yeah, I thank you for pointing that out because I've been using the term competition, and I suppose in a sort of abstract sense, a market sort of society is competitive because there are multiple different firms which are inputting their own information and are trying to work around that. But I think fundamentally, because a society in a freed market, because such a society is able to actually utilize information in a way. People are able to input information by mutually associating with other by associating with other people in pursuit of mutual interests, and people have a greater ability to do so because their access to resources and their like certain models of organization they deem to be more profitable or more beneficial to themselves than others are not discriminated against by the state. I would argue I would argue actually if we're going to talk about sort of social structure that a market is actually a cooperative system, and I would argue because
Well, that
it is
goes back
able.
to what I said, that exchanges in a market system are coercive, and so they're not like, it's not democratic or equitable exchanges between two people in a market system, or between, you know, an individual and a group or anything.
And we went over that, and I'm not gonna, I'm gonna try not to reiterate because I don't want to gish gallop. I know I wasn't doing that intentionally. Using the term gish gallop sort of implies that I was whatever, but just what I was getting to is that fundamentally, because more people are able to associate in more ways and there aren't any sort of marginal interests being discriminated against, and everybody is essentially able to have their own inputs to people who are able to have their ends met. I think that that system could be better described as cooperative, whereas democratic models, you may be able to describe them as cooperative to some extent, but at the very least, they're not as cooperative, and if we're going to get into the sort of post-Marxist idea of a planned economy. This doesn't necessarily seem to be yours, but there are many ideas of democratically planned economies which are actually hostile to the idea of sort of decentralized inputs and there not being a sort of democratic mandate. And so I would argue in some ways democratic models can be um, competitive in the way that you would criticize markets for being competitive, in the sense that there's one sort of body which, in order for each person to have their interests met, they would have to sort of brown nose to, in order to maybe get a to get favor with that organization. A lot. God damn it! I feel like I'm going. I feel like I can't explain anything now because I feel like I'm gish galloping, as you put it, and I'm sorry
No,
about
no,
that.
you're
But
you're not. It's just fine. Your 3 minutes is up, so just hold on to that
this
thought,
is
and we'll let Radical Reviewer address some of the points that you made.
okay.
Just going to lean back on the point that in sort of market exchanges, they're inherently coercive. You know, if you're a man in a patriarchal society, if you're white in a racist society, then there's these systems in place that impact your ability to engage in an exchange in a fair way. And so in order to make the exchange fair, we sort of pull back from that and have the exchange happen on democratic lines, instead, with people either doing some sort of voting in some sort of way, some sort of democratic structure. Because markets they're not meritocratic. They don't properly reward for output or effort. The genetic lottery, for example, people being born much taller, stronger than the other person. If you're coming to the open marketplace to do an exchange, having a democratic system in place that allows for more equitable exchange between those two parties or multiple parties, I think is going to be a better representation of self-determination, of self-management, and avoid hierarchy, etc.
In the case of the genetic lottery or examples you provided there, for one thing, uh, someone being taller or stronger, that doesn't predispose them to any sort of industry practice. You can be 6'8" and weigh 220 pounds of pure muscle, and you'd still you could still be a computer programmer, for example. And this is sort of what I was mentioning earlier, where preferences and how individuals associate it occurs in a sort of internalized marginal basis. It's not really a matter of how you're on that basis is not really a matter of how you're born, and this is sort of what I was talking about earlier, where
Decisions based on that. I mean, if you're hiring someone, I mean, there's all kinds of studies to show that people hire based on these factors that don't actually impact the work that the person is capable of, but hiring practices tend to be racist, tend to be sexist in a market system.
Well, they tend to, there are many arguments there. I would have, you could cite, if you could cite a specific study, that'd be great. But I could argue against that point regardless. This again is an example where I think that the burden is being placed onto market organizations, market firms, but I think that this more abstractly is a consequence of state secured privilege, not in the sense that states are literally giving direct incentives to businesses to discriminate against Black people or any other type uh, type of person on an identitarian basis, though historically that has happened. uh, what I would argue is that because of business subsidy and because these firms are able to scale up to a much larger extent than they would be able to otherwise in an actual free market. What I would argue is that these firms are not able to evaluate the marginal preference of each, not the marginal preference, are not able to evaluate the actual efficiency of each worker, or are able to actually input information related to each individual worker's contributions that they otherwise would be able to, and that leads indirectly to some sorts of discriminatory practices. So I think that again, a freed market would be a better solution to this, because it would get rid of the core problems causing a lot of these discriminatory practices. Presumably, when you bring up discrimination, however, you're not just referring to an inequity between people of different races represented by statistics. Not to go all Sargon, but if that's the case, then that might just be incidental. Or are you actually going to bring some sort of causal factor behind the studies, which is kind of why I was asking for you to cite a specific study.
you just Google, racial hiring study, or they typically give the name one, where if you put like an black sounding name at the application and apply two applications that are exactly the same, but the name is changed, and then then the response is the white person gets called, significantly more.
Okay, and
Okay, yeah. So I think that we're getting a little bit off topic here, though. When it comes to, I just want to interject one thing that I just want to clarify here with ESO is that when you're talking about an anarcho-communist structured society, you're not talking about a society that is putting in a specific number of hours towards how much work you get out of that society. You simply work, and you get out of that society what the society provides to you. There is no reason to keep track of how much somebody is working or how much somebody isn't working. You'll already know that because you're working next to the people that are doing that sort of thing. So if you need to keep track of if Dave, right, is never working, is never coming into work, is never doing anything that he needs to be doing, then everybody else in that cooperative is going to look at Dave and be like, yeah, no, Dave, it's not working out. We're going to give you a different position or whatever it is. But it's not the idea that people have to be putting in X amount of hours to be getting out X amount of progress. It's a matter of putting in work that is necessary and receiving things that are from that labor. Putting in from each according to their ability and taking out from each according to their need.
okay, well, just not assuming any sort of models of organization that creates, that gets into sort of the problems of conceptions of value. That gets into sort of LTV versus marginal utility, which incidentally, I just made a very in-depth video criticizing that for the specifically the labor theory of value for anyone who's watching the stream that might be interested. But just what I have to say about that is that argument fundamentally assumes that there is a sort of objective calculation for labor, and I would dispute that heavily. I think that and as I've argued, this is more, there are various sort of marginal factors which will input this. In fact, when you factor in capital, for instance, you really get to the point where even from a sort of cost theory basis, assuming that there is a sort that the supply of whatever resource is the basis for its value, just in general, you run into problems with that because the cost of supplies themselves are sort of their own markets or are affected by um, their own markets. For instance, manufacturing steel, well, that, there's labor input there, but then there's also the cost of maintaining, the machines that can heat metal to the point where they can be molded. There's obtaining the steel and all of the inputs in shipping or mining the steel, and all of the factors related to those industries. Which is why, even from, like, if you were to go back to even the sort of 19th century individualist, you'll find people like Josiah Warren, who even prior to the formulation of the law of diminishing marginal utility, were just Owenists and associated with Owenist colonies, and recognized that people had not only different interests but different conceptions of interests and different evaluations of their own resources, which made such a model inefficient, if not impossible, to work in lived reality how it's proposed to on paper.
Okay, I want to go to Radical Reviewer before we switch topics because I do want to get into this other topic here. But you can have one more 3-minute segment just to let us know what you think about this, and then we got to move on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my position is still basically the same in regards to remuneration. If whether it's a workplace or whether it's a community that you're engaging with. I think that the decision making should be democratic, and that and that's it.
All right, absolutely perfect. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the left-right dichotomy, specifically philosophical framing narratives. Now, you guys brought this topic up to me, so how about Radical? Please, since you haven't talked a whole lot here, I want you to give me give me a description on what exactly that is that you're talking about, and tell us your position on it.
And I'm gonna be going AFK for
I
a
say
second.
there's all kinds of ways to look at a political
Really
understanding.
quick, I'm not trying to interject. I'm just letting you all know I'm probably gonna be going. I'm gonna be going AFK for I don't know how long. So if I don't respond, Filthy, could you please interject?
Yeah, sure. I'll be here.
Cool. Okay, so various political compasses, right, and ways of people thinking about where their political alignment lands as far as the various sort of political schools of thought that exist. I think that anarchism, which we all claim to be anchored to in one form or another, I think that anarchism runs the broad spectrum of left to right, but I would say just in thinking about the world, but I would say as far as an actual working model of anarchism, that a band like the band Crass, I would say is sort of a AWA, anarchist without adjectives. You know, they have songs denouncing capitalism and that hierarchies that come along with capitalism. They have songs denouncing Marx and Lenin and stuff. So they're sort of the center, if you will. And if you go to the right of that, you start going into anarchist schools of thought that I think don't work out in reality. And then if you go to the left of that, you see anarchist schools of thought that either have worked out in reality, if you look at like various tribal cultures, or if you look at whatever, the CNT, or like a anarchist bookstore or something, right, that tries to run things on sort of more of a non-hierarchical democratic system, you start to go towards a to be applied in the real world and is very equitable and just and aligns with my worldview. That's what I have
Okay.
to say about that.
Okay. So my position, and I'm almost certain is Esso's position, is that, well, the political spectrum has absolutely no explanatory power in regards to being able to apply labels to or helping people understand political philosophies. And while certain terms have evolved over time, of course, the political spectrum model has really done a disservice in regards to doing this. Typically, the way that the political spectrum came about was during the French Revolution, where the pro-monarchist levels members of parliament sat on the right side, while the more anti-monarchists sat on the left. However, over time, it has since transformed into multiple political compasses that all not only exist but continue to occupy or place multiple very conflicting ideas onto the political compass. So, on the right, for example, you might have monarchism, you'll have paleo-libertarianism, you might have conservatism, you could have anarcho-capitalism, and not to mention like a whole bunch of people with wildly disparate ideas are also occupy the same space. So, for example, you have Adolf Hitler, you have George W. Bush, and you have Ron Paul. Three people I think most people would agree are right winged. Does that sound about right?
I missed the last part after they think, after naming George Bush, Ron Paul, etc.
Most people would agree that that all three of those people are right wing. Is that right? Hello.
Sorry,
Did I cut
Radical
out?
Reviewer. Go ahead and you can answer him. I just had to deal with something in the chat for a second.
Yeah, it was just a
To varying degrees, those folks are right wing. I mean, it's complicated to take all of economics, politics, social interactions, and you know, deduce one to the other. I think Rothbard in For a New Freedom talked about that a lot. That like, okay, well, I am agreeing with, you know, the left. Am I on the extreme left or the extreme right? Because I tend to agree with both on many different things, right?
Yeah, and that's the point I'm making. And I think you actually made it very well. That ultimately, when you're labeling something as right wing,
Reason
you're
why I can
applying
watch
to
South
it
Park and love it sometimes and hate it other times.
pretty much. So that's the point that I'm just trying to make. That when you label something as left wing or right wing, I am confused because when you say like I'm right wing, that means that I am simultaneously a globalist, a nationalist, and an individualist at the same time. It's the same thing. It's the same problem I have with capitalism in that it's a term used to describe something with completely contradictory ideas. It's it does nothing. It has no explanatory power, and quite frankly, it's a horrific, like just abhorrent oversimplification of someone's ideas. So I think this pretty much concludes the point that I'm trying to make about, yeah, the political spectrum ultimately has no explanatory power and doesn't explain anyone's ideas. Ultimately, it's just appealing to people's tribalism because someone who, you know, goes about their lives doing what they do, trying to get along, they might have an idea for whether or not they're left wing or right wing. And ultimately, it's like saying identifying something as left wing or right wing. All it really does is just identify it as being part of my tribe or not my tribe.
And I'm not even really looking at I'm not even looking at the chat because I'm sure I'm just getting dunked on in there, and I that would distract me. But um, yeah, and that's sort of why in the beginning I said that I find capitalism to be a contentious term, and that's sort of what I mean by that is that it's a concept which is clearly designed to destroy meaning in its colloquial use because it applies to varying different ideas which all have contradictory premises to one another, or conceptually don't even operate around the same sort of argumentative basis. And I think that the left-right dichotomy, as it was sort of constructed, isn't necessarily an anti-concept, but it was created originally, of course, by the French National Assembly to sort of describe parties and political affiliations within the sort of state structure. And
Yeah, I mentioned that while you were
okay,
gone.
well, and I'm not going to go too much into that because Filthy apparently already mentioned it. But what I was going to say about that is that, you know, that sort of creates the sort of problems I brought up earlier with central models just on an ideological basis, where, yeah, as Filthy pointed out, it becomes impossible to identify something as right wing or left wing because one's conception of, like, say for instance, a right wing idea is something that's hierarchical, so to speak. Like that's something that's considered to be a right wing idea. Well, there's a reason why free marketers, if you actually go back to the French National Assembly, like Bastiat, for instance, would consider themselves to be on the furthest left. Actually, if you were to look that up, that's something pretty interesting. Proudhon and Bastiat in the French National Assembly sat right next to each other on the farthest left. But even though nowadays they're considered to be on the polar opposite, and that's because fundamentally uh, one's conception of a hierarchical idea is entirely based on their own sort of internalized conclusion of what an idea leads to. And because sort of how people process information or convey information is relative to to basically its own innate extent, the problem that creates is it becomes impossible to define something along these sort of abstract lines. So the left right dichotomy or any sort of political dichotomy which operates on a sort of linear path can't really exist.
I would say that it's not that it has no explanatory power. I just think that it has very limited explanatory power. I think because of let's say in the United States we've got like this red states, blue states kind of thing, that people tend to think of it in a lot more like rah rah vote for your team kind of situation. But like a little bit about myself, for example, my father is a reactionary, pro Trump, thinks that Sandy Hook was fake, thinks Obama is like a Kenyan Muslim. However, if he were to take a political compass test or something, right, where that places him, you can kind of make like a rough approximation of his various beliefs based on that, right? So it has some explanatory function to that capacity. Even though, like him and I could talk about, let's say, um, the Second Amendment and the Black Panther Party, and we'd be on the same page, even though he otherwise would completely oppose like what the Black Panther Party stood for, right? I just think that it does have some, and maybe even more so for the sake of arguing. When I argue with my father about something, I can point to the values that are part of his political system and see where they're, and say, well, maybe actually you're aligned with, a similar value in my political system, right? So I think that it has function to that degree for the sake of has it functions as a sort of general guideline, but not an exact approximation of someone's viewpoints.
I mean, you talked about taking a political compass test. Problem is, which political compass?
And the other problem is, as I noted,
JRAG or whatever.
There are.
okay,
You can just go on Google Images, DuckDuckGo Images, or just your favorite image search engine. Type in political compass, and you'll find hundreds of different political spectrums, which have hundreds of different definitions. Some go from anarchism to totalitarianism. Some go from communism to fascism. Some go from globalism to nationalism. Some go
and
from I believe that there was one political scientist in the 50s who came up with a political political spectrum that was basically gentleness to firmness. So, do you
yeah,
want to
and
say
the
something?
problem with all of them is that they all conceptualize the ideas or the sort of spectrum and where the ideas sit differently from one another, based pretty much on the bias of the people creating the studies. And that's not even, that's not even something which is a conscious effort. That's just people have different conceptions of different positions based on their own sort of worldview. If we are assuming fundamentally um, that the framework of a sort of central body creating legislative fiat is legitimate, which most people do, and which the idea of a political spectrum is conceptually based around.
And just one thing I wanted to add real quick. I completely understand the appeal and the function that a political spectrum is supposed to have because, I mean, there are hundreds of different political philosophies and political affiliations. I'm not even talking about parties. I'm talking about just think about the different disparate schools of thought under anarchism, let alone every single statist philosophy. So being able to put them all under like a handful of umbrellas is going to be incredibly useful. The problem is that, well, the political spectrum does not serve this function.
Yeah, and just what I was gonna say really quick is if you really get down to it, all that exists really are just different preferences for association. And the reason why people in state societies conflate this with a sort of ethical perspective is because um, the state describes its legislative fiat as a sort of representation of a specific marginal preference, and therefore it's sort of implied through the narrative the state is attempting to create that coercive violence is being used against you to discriminate against your interests the through legislative fiat and policy proposals, and the only way to counteract this is to use violence against other people. And I think fundamentally that can only exist assuming a couple things about the state which are disassociated from reality, like the fact that states operate around philosophies and aren't just firms like any others that have a monopoly in arbitration and are simply operating in pursuit of their own perceived material interests and everything, or the fact that states have a structural incentive to antagonize the interests of people who aren't associated with the state, and that being very evident if you just look at how police or state distributed healthcare works. Um,
I think that
so,
like I
were
think
you
that
gonna?
if we're to look at a political compass, let's say if we're all anchored in some form of anarchism, I would say that we all kind of rest maybe somewhere on the bottom of the standard four quadrant political compass, and maybe one side and the other side would be individualism or you know
That
of a social or collective concept. So I think like when I'm going to join a group of people to hang out or to work in a workplace or to like live, five roommates to a place, I'm understanding that like I'm very impacted by the social structure that I'm existing in, and I'm impacting it as well, where like maybe a more atomistic individualistic approach would say like, oh well, I have free will and my own autonomy, and I'm not as influenced as others, as a more left-leaning person might think that I am, or something like that.
but
Well,
that's
that
I mean that's
assumes that the political spectrum is based on collectivism versus individualism, as well as uh, anarchy versus totalitarianism.
And that's sort of the other problem. For one thing, that sort of you're describing different models of association, unless there's sort of an ethical distinction there between what people are proposing. There's nothing collectivist about inherently collectivist about associating with a cooperative or a mutual aid society, and there's nothing inherently
In them,
individualist about associating within a sort of profit centered market exchange or barter or whatever you think of as being the sort of quote unquote right wing market. Um, Fundamentally, what
the
determines whether or
explanatory
not
value.
what was that? Out from most of what you were saying. All I heard was explanatory value.
I wouldn't say it's about which one is more intrinsic. I'd say it's which one has the most explanatory value. I would look at a group of
Right.
people interacting and think like I would look at it with a collectivist approach, that they aren't individually making decisions individually. I would say they're all probably impacting their decision making because they're interacting socially.
Right, and that's not something that any individualist would dispute. What I'm trying to point out is the fact that it's incoherent to describe different models of association as being somehow a different political perspective, because fundamentally, what one de- the way one decides that they will associate is ultimately based on their own marginal preferences, which isn't even really ideological. Ideology can influence that, but there are multiple other factors which influence that as well. Um, and what I would argue is that I would argue I would probably go a step further than either Aaron or you, in arguing that authoritarianism of any variety uh, doesn't really have I mean, there are people who would believe in it, but that doesn't mean that it is a political position. It just means that because authoritarianism is fundamentally incoherent. I would argue it doesn't really
What I mean
have a
by
place on.
authoritarianism is fundamentally incoherent.
What I mean by it is that it's not actually possible to consistently believe in an authoritarian position, because authoritarian positions are themselves inconsistent. I can go into greater detail if you would like, but
Well,
that's
okay,
the
so
point.
we're hitting about the 2 hour mark here, so I want you guys to just wrap up what you have left to say about this specific topic, and then we are going to have to move on.
Okay, but just what I was going to say is that I don't think that you can really I don't think you can really be fundamentally anything other than an anarchist. And I mean, maybe you may not conceptualize yourself as an anarchist, but fundamentally, um, everyone is. It's just a matter of how consistently they are operating around sort of what is naturally observable, or how violent they are towards another person versus how peaceful they are towards other people. I don't think that that's a different political ideology. I think political affiliations, as I mentioned earlier, are a socially dysgenic consequence of the state and aren't something people actually believe.
Okay, so
And
radical reviewer, I want you to respond to that, and then I basically want you to sum up your point about this specific topic, and then we are going to move on.
Yeah, I still think that understanding where people align on some sort of political compass can be useful for trying to understand what their broader worldview is, or what other points of contention might exist between you and another person. I think when it comes to anarchists lying on the sort of bottom of the political compass, as it were, I align more with understanding that humans are social, interact socially. We're heavily impacted in a sort of determinist sense. We're heavily impacted by the society around us, and that impacts our decision, our worldview, as opposed to maybe a more atomistic or individualist free will, whatever approach that might deny or not see the impact that society has on an individual's worldview or how they make decisions.
Glad you brought that up. I don't know how much time we have to go into that, but
I will give you 1 minute to respond.
okay. Well, you say that the free will perspective is fundamentally atomistic. I would dispute that. The free will objection to determinism is mainly based on the fact that it's completely tautological. But the other problem is that the sort of structures which exist in society, which people are incentivized to operate around. I kind of touched upon this earlier, but they are themselves influenced by individual actors. So I think that the determinist. I think is looking at the fact that these things can influence human behavior and saying human behavior is fundamentally determined by systems in society, while I think the free will perspective is more social structures are created by individuals. and are influenced heavily by individuals. And I think that would also it would also be important to internalize that, because that creates a better strategic approach in subverting the state.
Okay, Radical Reviewer, do you have anything to say to that before we move on?
No, I think I'm good. Other points that I would have to make, I think, are part of the next subject anyway.
Okay, perfect. So the next subject that we're going to be talking about is natural law versus utilitarianism, and clearly Esso and Radical Reviewer and I all have different thoughts on all of that. So since Radical Reviewer and Esso, you guys both have been talking a little bit and explaining these things, Heretic, did you want to explain this, or do you want to just hold off for now?
Yes, please, because I think he has better arguments than I do on this perspective.
Okay, so I think the natural law argument has ultimately the most explanatory power in regards to right questions of right and wrong and the best, most preferable behaviors for people to be able to engage in. The problem with utilitarianism is that it ultimately can be used to justify literally anything. And of course, the problem with that is you get into the questions of rape, murder, and theft. All you have to do to justify rape, murder, and theft from a utilitarian standpoint is to simply make the argument that there's a net increase in the happiness. I mean, surely the happiness of the 5 people that are gang raping the 14-year-old teenage girl means that this is a net benefit to society, and therefore, from a utilitarian perspective, the 14-year-old teenager has no justification to claim that anything wrong was done to her. And I think we can all agree that not only just in terms of from an emotional point of view, that rape is wrong, but we can also identify this logically. Rape, by definition, is involuntary sex. If rape were ethical, then rape would be expected, and therefore no form of rape could possibly be non-consensual. Therefore, rape couldn't possibly exist under a framework of rape is justified. So because of the rule of non-contradiction and the rule of consistency, the only logical explanation, therefore, because the question of rape is wrong and rape is right are a true dichotomy, then the only just explanation is that rape is wrong, which, of course, utilitarianism flies heavily in the face of.
Okay, Radical Reviewer, tell me exactly what your disagreement, if any, is to that statement. Are you there?
Hi, were you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to hear your opinion on it, because that was basically the outline of what Heretic believes, but I want to know what your angle is on it as well.
Yeah. So you folks, I believe, are coming from the deontological perspective, which is that actions are either right or wrong, almost intrinsically. Where a utilitarian, I'm more of like a rule utilitarian, with the goal being not necessarily human happiness as much as promoting self-management, whatever sort of choice promotes the most self-management, the most you know power to make decisions individually is the goal. Um, the way that I kind of think of it, comparing the two, is if you folks are familiar with mandatory minimum sentencing laws. So if someone commits the crime of, let's even make it something bad, like the rape or something. Someone commits that crime. Um, if there's a mandatory minimum, then you're not allowed to look at all the other factors that go into what took place. You're sort of shutting yourself off from that and say, okay, well, they, out of A and B, they performed B, therefore this always has to be what is the consequence of that. Where my outlook would be, yes, rape is wrong, but not because rape by itself is intrinsically wrong, and it's this sort of deontological, it goes in the category, the box of wrong, and so therefore it's wrong, but rather that, okay, a rape is an infringement on another person's self-management, and so it is wrong. But with a utilitarian worldview, you know, we can weigh ethically, like whatever, people can come up with like silly examples. This person, you know, killing this person who has some sort of disease, where if they're not killed instantly, that disease will spread and wipe out, you know, half the planet or something. You can make judgments on that, where maybe a deontologist position might be that murder is always wrong. Well, okay, but what are you supposed to do in this situation? Because this not engaging in this murder is going to lead to bigger problems down the road. So yeah, I believe in the ability to weigh options, with the goal being maximizing people's self-management, self-determination.
So, for lack of a better term, self-management. I'm just going to ask a few questions here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so self-management sounds like a different way of explaining the deontological concept of and the natural law concept of self-ownership. Does that sound accurate and fair?
I think that self-ownership certainly is a part of it, but self-management also involves decision-making within a group.
Decision-making within a group. So, could you elaborate?
Like if I'm in a workplace, right, and we're going to decide to add an air conditioner, right? It's not necessarily an issue involving self-ownership that I personally am owning a body that likes a certain temperature or something. I'm deciding socially with the other people of the workplace whether we want to the cost benefit analysis of, like, do we want the cost of an air conditioner or whatever to benefit us socially.
Okay, so you have to submit your I'm not sure I understand completely.
I heard you have to submit and cut off after that.
No, I was just trying to mull it over in my mind, and I was kind of thinking out loud.
I think what he's essentially trying to make the consequentialist argument, which is that something which has the most benefit is ultimately right versus something which is ethically justifiable. Am I in the ballpark there?
Yeah, basically, like if like rape is such an extreme example, but if you were to just say, um, you know, in a deontologist position, rape is wrong categorically, it seems to me to be more along the lines of applying a mandatory minimum sentencing decision without referring to larger context involved in the decision, where you could look at, like, okay, who were the people involved, what sort of like upbringings brought them to these various decisions. A formulation that I kind of like on this was described by Thought Slime in Thought Slime's video, All Cops Are Bad, that if a person has no choice but to be a criminal, then we can't really blame them for that. And if there is an option for them to be a criminal or not, then we should help them not to be.
Okay, well,
To try and avoid the sort of atomized individualist approach of, like, this person did a bad thing. Okay, well, what social factors played into them doing a bad thing? How do we amend those social factors?
okay, well, it still doesn't really address the main criticism I had, in that it could literally justify anything. It's
So
simply you're replacing you can justify literally anything in the name of happiness to you can justify literally anything in the name of self-management.
And also, this seems almost to be more of like a pragmatic argument for a specific model of arbitration rather than an actual ethical perspective, because that position, the problem fundamentally with consequentialist arguments, as I mentioned earlier, is that information by itself doesn't have any cohesion. There needs to be a sort of underlying narrative which can contextualize and frame information, and any sort of consequentialist argument fundamentally lacks this. and consequently there's no real ability to say that something is wrong or right in any sort of perspective, or you could, but there's no sort but within that framework there's nothing negating somebody else saying, well, I think it's right because this and this.
Yeah, so you know what? I'm going to interject here for a
I
second.
think
So the main thing that I think that we're falling into the trap of is that we believe here that there's either all one way or all the other way, right? And when it comes to making different decisions on certain laws, say like rape, like murder, like theft, that sort of thing, all those situations have to be taken on a case-to-case basis with, and in my understanding of anarcho-communism, with the idea in mind that you want to increase health and well-being and reduce pain and suffering. So you gave an example earlier where you were saying 6 people are together raping one person, and that inherently increases the health or the I guess the happiness of those 6 people while reducing the happiness of one. Therefore, it's beneficial for society. Therefore, that argument doesn't work because you have that example. But I would actually contest that and say that is an incredibly uncharitable way of looking at those sorts of situations, because those 6 people doing that rape would inevitably create a problem within the whole of society where it makes something that's as abhorrent as rape actually being a good thing, right? So it's not necessarily whether or not rape is good or bad, or murder is good or bad, though you can make the argument that rape is certainly bad 100% because it reduces health and well-being and does not increase reduces health and well-being and increases pain and suffering. But to say that it automatically is null and void because that those 6 people or whatever are benefiting from it, I think is uncharitable and doesn't look at the entirety of the situation. It doesn't look at things in anything other than a vacuum.
There's a problem. I want to answer this.
Okay, then can I answer? Can I provide an answer?
Oh, of course.
After you.
Yeah, of course. So the deontological perspective has a very clear understanding and explanation as to why rape is monstrous and abhorrent. I'm not sure what the utilitarian argument that rape is abhorrent is. You said that the consequence of the gang of 6 people gang raping a teenage girl is bad because it'll increase the amount of rape in society, and that's bad because rape is abhorrent. But
No,
I don't know why.
no. That is not what I said at all. That is a complete fabrication of what I said. What I said is that rape in general reduces the health and well-being of the entirety of society. So those 6 people that are benefiting from it, even though there are more of them than the person that is getting raped, right? In a societal aspect, that does not benefit the society. That only benefits those 6 people. So what you're doing is perpetuating a problem that inherently reduces the health and well-being of the entirety of society, for the simple fact of, well, we can put obvious logical places on where those sorts of things are harmful. Like rape can cause physical injuries. Rape can cause mental injuries. Rape can cause all of these different things that you can actually point to and say, these are actual problems that are scientifically, medically tested, that can tell you that they are not a good thing. So it's not just like we're pulling it out of our ass saying, oh, well, this argument, rape is bad because rape is bad and that's all I have to say about it. No, rape is bad because we can physically point to science behind rape being bad. And then on top of that, not to discredit people's feelings about things, that also is a factor as well. And rape is bad also because people feel that rape is bad. So it has everything involved saying that it is not a good thing.
So did you want to take this one?
Yeah, there were 2 major points that I had to go over. The first one, well, you'd kind of already went over that, but my criticism here still stands, which is that there's nothing which actually would still point to rape being bad from a consequentialist perspective. You can use science, you can use how people generally feel, you can make an argumentum ad populum, but from the consequentialist perspective, there's nothing which says, okay, so there's science behind this, or there is, it's popular to not like it, that makes it bad. There's nothing behind consequentialism which establishes a cohesive claim there. It's still just as easy, it's just as easy from a consequentialist perspective to argue uh, people don't like it, and therefore it's avant-garde, or it's something which is desirable depending on the individual in question. So that
Okay, so I think the major problem here is that you both have completely mischaracterized my argument, and you're not paying
well,
attention to the words that I'm saying. So what I'm saying is
I'm
that in
not.
society, right? If a society,
I
if
was
you're
getting to
raping people
that.
in a society, right, then that creates a problem where there are physically people being injured by that rape, and mental injuries as well. And on top of that, there is also the societal factor that rape is considered by people to be bad. So you're only focusing on the one factor, me saying that, oh, people do believe rape is bad. That is a factor, but there is
I'm
also the
not,
other
though.
factors involved as well.
Saying what I'm saying is that from the consequentialist argument, there is no cohesion between uh, whatever you point to, which suggests that it's bad, and it being something which society actively recognizes as being bad and works to counteract, which is what I was getting into. Your perspective seems to treat society as if it is a legal entity, or as if it's some sort of body, and you were complaining about mandatory sentencing or minimum mandatory sentencing. Well, that's exactly the sort of perspective, or the sort of problem which leads to minimum mandatory sentencing, because the thing is with any sort of justice is that it only really, social factors aside, whether or not an act of aggression was committed is only a matter between the criminal who committed the act of aggression and the person who was victimized. So, creating this social element not only makes it sort of more difficult for information to be put into a sort of any sort of arbitration hearing, because it's ultimately between the person who committed the crime and the person who was victimized. But also, this creates all these sorts of weird inconsistencies where there are arbitration standards that exist separate from the actual crime committed, and that can lead to things like non-violent actions being considered crimes because they have a perceived social consequence.
You know
Let's.
what? Here's the one other problem that I'm having with this is that you're making the dichotomy between consequentialist arguments and whatever it is that you're arguing for. But that wasn't the point of this debate. The debate was specifically laid out as natural law versus utilitarianism. So I think you're kind of putting words in our mouths, saying that we are consequentialist or whatever exactly that you're saying. What I'm talking about here is
I,
I'm talking
I
about
asked
focusing on things as
radical.
though they are paying attention to specific laws and that sort of thing being changed and adapted depending on the situation. Like I said, increasing health and well-being, reducing pain and suffering. So if you steal something, right, and it harms the person that's selling that thing, sure. But if it in fact feeds you and makes sure that your life is sustained for another day, then that would inevitably create or increase health and well-being and reduce pain and suffering. Right, so that's the argument that we're going for. But I think that you're making you're building a straw man here by erecting this thing saying that we're all about consequentialism or all about this other thing or whatever it is. That's not what the argument is about.
For one thing, I asked Radical Reviewer for clarification as to whether or not he was coming from a consequentialist perspective, and he said that that was correct. So I'm not mischaracterizing your position. I'm just taking what you've said to me, and I'm presenting your argument as you would have characterized it.
have a-
Whether or not you want to call it utilitarianism or consequentialism, fundamentally, I'm not misrepresenting your position, because in either case, it still suffers from the same problem, which you have.
But it doesn't, though, because you're clearly
I
you're
think-
clearly
I
just
think
not
that I
listening
have
to what
a-
we're having, what we're actually saying, though. Because whenever I clarify what I'm talking about, you come in saying, "Oh, well, you actually mean this," and you only actually mean that it has to do with people's perception of it. But it has nothing to do. It does have to do with people's perception of it. Sure, that is a factor, but one of many factors.
I think I have an example that's at least relevant to me that I think maybe encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to talk about. Have you all played or are familiar with the game Last of Us?
I know of it, but I haven't played it.
Okay, so spoilers to everyone in chat, but because if you have a PlayStation Network, you get Last of Us, the HD remake, for free. So I'm playing it again, and now it's on my mind. Bear with me. Okay, so the Last of Us game, there's zombies. There's this girl, and the scientists are gonna like dissect the girl because she has a cure to the zombie epidemic, but it is going to kill her in the process. So this is like a nice little ethical experiment, right? Should the girl be dissected for the sake of trying to stop this epidemic that's happening, this zombie apocalypse that's taking place, right? An ethical kind of thing. And I think that a deontological position might be, well, murder is always wrong, or this is like infringing on this young girl's autonomy by dissecting her. Where I think to a certain degree, utilitarianism or whatever, the consequences would be, okay, dissecting this person will lead to a lot of betterment for society as a whole, or the human race, or solve the epidemic or whatever. But I think that on top of trying to maximize human happiness, we should have a goal of, or even besides the goal of maximizing happiness, should be the goal of self-management. And so perhaps most definitely the girl being dissected should have a say in what takes place, whether or not she's dissected to save the larger human race from this pandemic. But I also think like the scientists and the humans that are going to be saved also need to be taken in account to this decision, because they are impacted by it in the similar way to like the rape scenario.
Do you mind if I interject here?
Yeah, that's fine.
From a utilitarian perspective, why do we care what the girl thinks?
Like, she gets a say, just in proportion to what's going on, not the sole say.
But why though? Her sacrifice is clearly going to be of immense benefit to mankind. So what benefit is it of mankind to have her to be able to object?
Why wouldn't she be able to get the ability to object?
Has self-management?
It wouldn't hurt. Yeah, exactly. Like Radical Reviewer said, that allows you for more self-management, that sort of thing. Everybody's opinion would still be valid. It just wouldn't be enough of an opinion to matter unless she was able to sway people, right? If she was able to sway people with her argument, then that would be a different story.
And that's they're sort of my two problems with this perspective. The first one is fundamentally that it does sort of conflate a pragmatic argument and an ethical argument, and that actually is important, because that creates a sort of false narrative and false dichotomy where there are only two possibilities, or there are only a certain number of possibilities, where if you look at it from the natural law perspective, which doesn't create these sort of incentives tied to ethical dilemmas, it allows for more information to be communicated. So, I mean, there's the one problem there, that if you're talking about this from a pragmatic perspective, there's benefit even from that angle to the deontological perspective, because it allows for more information to be communicated. But secondly, this argument has horrible, unfortunate implications, because it's essentially arguing that whether or not someone has a right completely divorced from social structures or ethical arguments is entirely determined by what other people say or circumstance, and that people can be subjugated based on what other people think ought to be done to them. Which, yeah, in this example, it sounds very righteous to kill one person and have their within that false dichotomy, you kill one person and you cure a disease or whatever.
sense that oh well, murder is wrong, therefore it's, you know, self-evidently wrong. It's wrong in the utilitarian sense that this person we don't want to live in a society where people are murdered
in
to
and
harvest their
out.
organs. Am I should be good, right? Am I good? Can we hear me?
Hey,
Yeah, we can hear
is
you.
everything
Yeah,
still
everyone-
working, guys? Because my computer just crashed for a second, and I'm not sure if we lost everything. Is everything still up on the chat?
We're not
The
watching
chat's
this
doing
stream, but-
F's.
Let
I
me
see F's in
here.
chat.
God damn it.
I see F's and the CIA did it in chat. That's what I see.
They probably did. Because
Fuck's sakes, just give me a second here to see if I can figure it out, because I'm not exactly sure.
All right. We have actual screen caps
The
of
ethical decision. What is a better use of my time, to explain my idea now, though it's not on stream, or to explain my idea later while it is on stream?
No, I wasn't going to add to the debate. I was just going to say that we have actual screen caps, proof of web traffic going to our YouTube page, Filthy and mine. We have proof that some of it is coming from the FBI. Like, there are .fbi links coming to our YouTube page, so we know as a matter of fact that they do fucking watch us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think their reach has kind of gotten really extreme. An example I think about a lot is why is the U.S., for example, in a position that a lot of third world countries are not in? Well, that's because during the labor struggles in the U.S., the Pinkertons and the National Guard had rifles, but all the fucking World War I veterans also had rifles. Where nowadays, if people want to rise up and assert, their own self-determination, they're facing a group of workers versus face recognition software and all these FBI bots tracking what they do online. It's a very unequal battle.
Yeah, well, the other factor you're not taking into consideration there, I think it's more because for one, you have all these international state-sponsored cartels, like I mentioned earlier, the IMF or the World Bank, which are very clearly influencing sort of these global central trade policies around the interests of certain countries at the expense of others, and enforcing these with violence. So there's that factor. But then, there's also, because of that, you get all these conditions of scarcity where the only way people can have their interests met in the third world are, through sweatshop labor.
Are we back on? Does anyone know?
I think we're on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you guys are all back on. You're ready to go. Sorry about that.
What even is
So
going
just
like?
on the
Did
on
the
just
stream?
The stream kind
So
of.
are there like two streams? Are there two streams now? And one of them is the part where we cut out, and this is the second stream, or is this like restarting the other stream so the other recording isn't going to be saved?
No. I think it's still working on the same stream. Nothing else seems to have changed. The chat is still the same. Everything seems the same.
yeah.
Everything
When I
looks the
scroll
same.
backwards, it says it's 2.5 hours, so it's all going to be one video.
Okay, thank God.
So, just on the
I hope-
homelessness harvesting organs thing, right?
Yeah.
You know, you could look at it as, oh, well, it's totally utilitarian. This person is like contributing very little to society. They would do a lot more for society by having their organs, you know, harvested or something. Where I would say that like a utilitarian with a goal of maximizing self-management, especially, is that, well, I don't like the idea that we have a society where there's all these resources and people still find themselves in homelessness, and I wouldn't blame them solely for that. And I don't want to live in a world where people who, for various reasons, whatever, drug addiction, divorce, abandoned by their family, or whatever, find themselves in homelessness, are then punished to that degree for that. So I think that it is not utilitarian to harvest the organs of a homeless person, because to sort of zoom out from that, I don't want to live in a society where people who find themselves falling into homelessness are punished in that way.
Well, it's not that they're
well,
being punished. It's just that it's just that the self-management of the people who are receiving those organs, their ability to manage themselves is going to increase. You're going to have someone who has liver failure now as a liver. You have someone who has kidney failure now as a kidney. Someone who desperately needs a heart transplant has a heart, and you can go on and on and on. Ultimately, the organs harvested from a homeless person could help literally dozens of people. And you can make the argument that it improves their self-management.
Yeah, and
I want to say this is called the utility monster concept, that like it pumps out utility the more that you feed it, and it's because under those circumstances, right, it's like, oh, well, if we kill, you know, X amount of children who have nice, you know, fresh organs that aren't affected by smoking or drinking, like maybe an older person's might be, we kill X amount of children and harvest their organs for all the people that are waiting. But we still wouldn't want to live in a society where kids are killed to harvest their organs, even though there's a list of people waiting for organs. If you were to zoom out, you know, one click on the microscope there.
What I was gonna say is that factor, your perspective in a utilitarian society can be taken into consideration, but as you'd already sort of established, is kind of irrelevant, because it's ultimately up to what the majority's perspective is. And you know, what if the majority's perspective began to operate around a sort of conflation between health needs and material interest, along with what the sort of central organization in this society is deciding for the arbitration standard, the sort of legislative fiat being created. Let's say 51% of people said that homeless people, if a rich person needs an organ transplant, homeless people are to be killed and their organs are to be given to the rich person because the society deems rich people to be more important.
It's going to be a society with a very small population if they're going to vote like that.
Yeah, and that's literally the utility monster argument.
I think you're starting to understand the problem with utilitarianism as an ethical concept. It just doesn't work. It justifies everything, including most behaviors that I think we can all agree are just absolutely monstrous.
Monstrous compared to what? Like killing the girl in Last of Us, you know, for the sake of science, saves all of humanity, right? So to not have any sort of comparative compared to what?
And also, I really feel like this goes
is a
back to what I was
descriptor
saying a
meant
second
to-
ago. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm going to interject here. This really goes back to what I was saying just a second ago, where everything is always all one way or all the other, right? You're never going to find 100% perfect solution to all of humanity's problems, because humans are not computers. They exist in meat space, right? They're going to make odd decisions. They're going to make all kinds of mistakes and stuff like that. So trying to put a groundwork, a 100% solid framework on every single decision that's ever made, like your non-aggression pacts and that sort of thing, it doesn't work in meat space. It doesn't work with human beings, because human beings are all different. They're all going to make different decisions about all sorts of things. And I think that the situation that Radical Reviewer brought up is a perfect example of that.
Was a perfect example of exactly the point you just made. The problem fundamentally is that utilitarianism, it doesn't work fundamentally in meat space, and the best way we can arrive at the most just solutions are to have as many competing arbiters as possible, and as much information as possible being conveyed, because otherwise, like I kind of mentioned earlier, you're going to get sort of a limited perspective on what can be done. And even in these sort of abstractions, fundamentally assuming that what's to assume that killing this girl even would save humanity in
Okay,
that
well,
situation.
let's not focus on
as
that
you
so
mentioned.
much. Let me ask you a question here, okay? So obviously there's a solution that Radical Reviewer brought up, but you haven't brought up a solution. You brought up a bunch more problems. So why don't you tell us the solution that you would have to that same scenario?
I did bring up the solution. I think that it's better for more people to be able to communicate more information, because it is entirely possible for more solutions to be brought up that I'm not even capable of conceptualizing. I could give you a couple solutions I could think of on the top of my head, which wouldn't end up killing the girl and could potentially save humanity, like a DNA sample. And then using that DNA sample to actually create to sort of isolate the genes in that girl, which could be used to then create a sort of to engineer cells which can
Sure,
fight.
but the problem with that is that you're completely recreating that entire scenario so it fits your narrative without dealing with the scenario in the way that it was constructed in the first place. So with the way the narrative was constructed in the first place, how would you deal with that situation?
Basically breaking the trolley argument by saying, well, I would just have a separate track. Like, well, that's not how the trolley argument works. There's 2 tracks. You have to choose one.
No, what I'm doing is I'm questioning fundamentally whether or not there actually is a trolley problem, and there are
Okay,
two
but that's
tracks.
great that you're questioning the problem, but that isn't offering a solution. Like I said a moment ago, we're offering solutions and you're offering more problems. So please
Well,
give us an answer to the problem.
if your dilemma is conceptually flawed, or there is something which is fundamentally separate from the dilemma as you've presented it, which could be done, such as creating a sort of society where more information could be communicated, which could highlight potential alternatives that could take place, uh, then fundamentally it doesn't matter, because that the sort of dilemma as you've presented it is divorced from lived reality.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer
That's
the
why I
question,
don't
right?
like
Like
trolley.
you're upset with the framing, but you're not answering the question, right? We could frame it in 100 different ways. We could set it up as a trolley problem. We could set it up as 100 different ways.
No, I'm
but you're not
not
actually
upset.
answering the question here. You're saying, "Oh, well, we could determine by talking to each other. We could figure things out." Great. You have 3 minutes to determine what you need to do in that situation. What do you do? Where's your solution?
What I'm saying is that the trolley dilemma itself is limited to the point where it's not helpful to discussion. That's what I'm saying.
But there's all kinds of problems like that in real life that aren't helpful to the broader discussion. It's just a fact that we have to make a decision. So in your scenario, how do you make that decision? How do you come to those conclusions without it just infinitely turning into this circle jerk of arguing back and forth about what is right or what could be right while the entirety of humanity dies?
Okay, and what I'm saying is that situations like that, where there are binaries created, that is fundamentally divorced from lived reality, and that's what I'm trying to explain.
Can
Not
I elaborate on this real quick?
because this is just turning into a pedantic back and forth.
Yeah, go ahead. Elaborate, please.
Okay, so in order for the scenario to work for any ethical dilemma, we have to have a lot of information, like a lot of it. So, for example, take the question of the girl in The Last of Us. We have to know with absolute certainty that there are no other methods of curing. You can't just quarantine either the infected or humanity themselves away from the infected and wait for them to die off. You can't just engage in some kind of genetic engineering, which would otherwise make humanity immune to any infection, or otherwise like genetically resistant, because I'm pretty sure you're aware of how pathogens work. You people aren't going to get infected by a disease carried by, or a disease that kills, I don't know, lizards. I mean, it can just anyways. People, so you have to know a lot of information. We have to know that this is literally the only scenario that could ever
We
possibly
try and make determinations based on our best approximations. I don't, what is this called, like a nirvana fallacy or something, like, oh, in the Last of Us situation, well, what if we could perfectly make a clone of her, or what if but
there's no
there's,
reason
you know,
you
we only
can't.
have so much time left in the day. We have to make determinations with the information we have available. I mean, you
And
could
there's
what if
nothing,
any scenario till you're blue in the face, but you have to make determinations with the information that's in front of you.
but I'm not making the what if
That's what it
scenarios.
is. You're
I'm pointing out that there are alternatives that in order for your scenario to hold up as a true binary, there has to be absolutely no possibility of alternatives, which means we have to know
Absolutely
that
not.
this is
That is
impossible. We have to
absolutely
know that.
just a false dichotomy. That there would
Can I
that
finish?
the problem is that you don't have enough time to make the decision.
Why not?
and
I
that's
mean, you have to know that as well. That's another
that's the
problem. We have to know that we have to know with absolute certainty that there is no time to even come up with these other alternatives.
No,
We
if
have to
you
know
know,
for
if
certain
you
that
have
these
to wait for
resources are
absolute
available.
certainty for every single decision that you ever make, if you have to wait for absolute certainty, you'll never make any decision ever. That's absolutely false. There's no way that society works that way. Even if so, we have 99.99% proof that CO2 is causing climate change, but we don't have 100% proof. So we better make sure, without beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we have 100% proof before we do anything about it. And until we do, we can't do anything about it at all, and then we all die. So how
the
exactly
climate
does that
change.
scenario work out?
I'm glad you brought up the climate change example because that's actually a perfect instance of what I'm talking about. The presented so there because it is the climate change argument is fundamentally conveyed from this sort of in mainstream debate from a sort of utilitarian perspective, which makes all sorts of these all sorts of base assumptions which are not actually in many cases are not actually backed up by tangible evidence. I'm not no like just to clarify, I'm not disputing the existence of man-made climate change for the sake of this argument. What I'm saying though is that when you propose doing something about it, it is always assumed fundamentally that state management or rationing schemes by most people when they discuss this, that's the thing to be done about it. And more information being interjected into this debate in a more neutral conceptual framework is needed here because there are much better solutions which exist outside of that. And in fact, that solution is terrible given the historical record of organizations which relate to managing resources and the environment managed by the state.
That's
Uh,
fantastic. I hear you. I hear all that, but you're not answering the question. You're not solving the problem. You have a limited time to make a decision that you have 99% certainty of that decision that you make will solve the problem. But you're saying that we
what I'm
don't make
trying
that
to get
decision
at is
because determinism isn't going to work because 100% of the time you can't have all of the answers. That's not an
no, what I'm
argument.
trying
That
to
is
get at
a
is
100%
that
an anti-argument.
What I'm saying fundamentally is that the way that this is being framed turns it into a loaded question when there are more possibilities. I'm the one who's saying that you're creating a false dichotomy, and you're the one who's arguing that, but you're not really explaining how this is a false dichotomy. You're the one operating under a false dichotomy, my friend, not us.
Okay, great. We'll use whatever fallacy you want to use. I'm not really interested in labeling fallacies. What I'm interested in is solving the problem, right? And what a Radical Reviewer has done so far is solve the problem, come up with a solution, and if it had worked, then the world is saved. But with under your solution, we sit around, we talk about it, we discuss and we discuss and we discuss until we get 100%.
That's another assumption that you'll have to know about.
Okay, I mean, well, what I'm saying is that we've come to a conclusion already, and now you guys are still arguing and trying to figure out if you can even come to a solution. So how exactly does that worldview even work?
That's also a straw man, or a misrepresentation. I'm not saying you can't come to a solution. I'm saying that there exist more potential solutions.
Okay, but then when do you determine? When do you determine? You know 99.9%, right? No, you know 99%, and then you discuss more, and then you get 99.9%. Do you need to have 100% because you're never going to get that 100%? But if not, then where do you draw that line, right? If it's not at 99.9, if it's not at 99, if it's not at 89, if it's not at 79, where do you draw the line? When do we get to finally make the decision before you decide that it's being deterministic or whatever it is?
Yeah, like I feel like this is very stops you from being able to make decisions about things, right? Like you're about to be intimate with a person and you're like, oh, well, condoms are only 99.99% effective. And who knows, maybe in the next 30 minutes, someone's going to invent something that's like even more effective. So I better just wait.
That's not my argument.
That doesn't make any sense. Like you have limited time to make decisions about things. So you make decisions with the best information available, not waiting until some hypothetical other information appears. That's not how decisions are made.
What you guys seem to be missing is that for one thing, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you need a better way to evaluate information, not just an amount of information. You need to have something for the sake of being completely practical. This is divorced entirely from the ethical argument at this point. It is better to have something where more information can be communicated, specifically so you don't end up getting trapped within these false dichotomies.
Okay, so I think the main problem that you're having here is that you're assuming that we're coming at this with the idea that we haven't already looked at the information, but we weren't even talking about whether or not the information has been gathered. We've already come to the conclusion. We have 99% certainty that this is the way to solve the problem, and now you're talking about an extra % of certainty to find out if we can find...
I'm not talking about an extra % of certainty. I'm talking about a different perspective. It doesn't matter how much information you collect. You can collect a bunch of information.
Okay, we understand that. Then explain to me what is the other method that we just haven't thought of.
You can frame out... I'm trying to explain that, but you keep talking over me. You can frame out competing contrary bits of information. What I'm talking about is you need more input in order to decide what is correct or how many outlets are correct. And that's fundamentally the problem with the sort of central utilitarian models, is they operate around the assumptions put forward by the people managing the...
But that's not how anarchism works, and that's not anything that we're fighting for. We're not even arguing that point.
Well, it's important.
Hold on a second. You said something very important.
Democratic situation would be everyone managing.
You said something very important.
Hold on. Well, I just want to finish up very quickly. And these sort of organizations create structural incentives to view things in a way which are provably disassociated from lived reality. In the example of the climate change argument, a great example of this, where you have these sort of central bodies creating incentives for people to evaluate information in a certain way, which for lack of a better way of saying this, predisposes them to coming to inaccurate conclusions. Okay, what were you gonna say, Filthy?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I think Aaron said something unbelievably important. We were trying to explain the problems with utilitarianism, and he made the remarks that that's not how anarchism works, and he is absolutely correct in that respect, which leads to the only logical conclusion of anarchism and utilitarianism are mutually exclusive and incompatible.
Mutually exclusive and incompatible are not the same thing, and they
You're
can.
right. I meant to say you're right. I meant to say incompatible. I apologize.
True at
I
all.
would
I mean, anarchism
completely
and
disagree with
utilitarianism
that.
totally go hand in hand. Also, just a heads up, I got to dip out in like 10, 15 minutes. I got to get ready for work. I already probably should have said that earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I'm
I
gonna be
totally
at work
agree.
in 30
We got
minutes.
about 5 minutes left, and then we're gonna have to wrap it up because we're hitting the 3 hour mark, and people are getting antsy here.
All right.
All right, fair enough.
All right, so
I
we're
don't
gonna go
know.
with closing statements.
Sort
Go
of,
ahead, Esso.
Leon-
We'll give you a closing statement. Let me hear what you have to say, and then we'll hear from Radical Reviewer and Heretic. If you want to tag in off after Esso, then go ahead.
All right.
Okay, well, I guess in conclusion, fundamentally, the point which I was hoping to establish with this stream, I have no idea how well this will be established by the people who are watching, but nonetheless, what I was attempting to the point fundamentally I was trying to make here is that there exists a stronger continuity between sort of free market libertarianism and the sort of colloquial what is colloquially understood to be left libertarianism. This is historically the case, and even in what's been argued here today, it seems like fundamentally we have sort of the same we're making the sort of same ideas. It's just that we have different conceptions which we have come to these conclusions through which create our differences. And I don't necessarily know about with you guys or you guys, but I would love to expand upon this in greater detail in the future, because I think that if we I think that fundamentally, if these things which sort of divide us, uh, which I think are fundamentally false, could be sort of broken down and deconstructed, I think that the sort of subversive approach, which both of these groups could undertake, along with with the amount of people uh, that such an alliance could create, would be a very powerful weapon against the state. That's all I have to say.
And Heretic, you want to jump off that?
Yeah. Fundamentally, how people associate, why people associate, and how they choose to associate is something that they're going to figure out for themselves. Ultimately, everything that we're going to be talking about in terms of how an anarchist society will organize, how they will do this, how they will do that, they're just guesses. Fundamentally, no one person on earth knows best how to organize society, and those that claim to do it through some form of planning mechanism are not really making arguments for their society or making their argument for the planned economy, but it's really more of an argument for why they should be emperor of the universe. I mean, anyone with that kind of knowledge probably ought to be the emperor of the universe, but I think that's reserved solely for God. Now, that said, uh, yeah, ultimately, I think that we should be having a free voluntary society so that we can have these competing firms to ultimately figure out like how best to answer these questions. How many apples ought there to be? How do we dispense justice? That sort of thing.
Awesome. Aaron, you have any closing remarks?
No, I'm pretty much good. You go ahead and do your closing remarks, and then I'll wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, cool. I think like this went pretty good, like about as well as trying to explain like absolutely everything can go. I think that if we liked this enough to try and do it again, we might want to be super specific with the topic. Maybe something like, how would we organize one workplace, and like have that, or we could even go topical with like the pulling out of Syria. Like, what do we think of that? But just like one really specific topic would maybe ground us like a little bit more. I think that obviously, folks watching, if you want to know anything more about our various perspectives, we've got YouTube channels with information all about that on there, as well as like authors and stuff that we've referenced. So if you want to know more, go do those things. That's all I got to say about that.
Absolutely. And Heretic and Esso, if you want to go ahead and plug your channels, please go right ahead.
All right. So our channel is Back Alley Philosophy. Pretty easy to find if you were to look it up on YouTube. And our videos are usually pretty lengthy and are able to delve into detail like this. We make essays, sort of like Radical Reviewer, but we sort of deconstruct conceptual ideas, or at least I do as well. And I just want to say, for anyone who's watching that was annoyed by me attempting to go into all that detail, well, I'm sorry about that. It's just, yeah, my position, there are it's a couple layers deep, and it takes a while to explain. That's just my style of presentation. I try and be conscious about that. It's difficult though when you got to explain 11 lines of logical progression in one point. I hope you understand.
And let's see here. By the way, what happened to the video I sent you?
I was gonna upload that today, actually.
Oh, okay, good, because I was about to plug the video that I'm currently working on. It's probably going to be an hour and 20-minute video talking about the 2008 financial crash. I know my audience is probably sick and tired of me plugging that by now, but yeah, figure a lot of people will be very interested in hearing what the real causes of the financial crash and the Great Recession were, instead of this government-approved narrative that's been circulating around since 2008.
It's actually more detailed than most Austro-libertarians would argue, and it actually carries a lot more explanatory power, I would argue. The video of his, which I'm gonna upload today, is a critique of fascism from an individualist perspective, and explaining why anarchy is essentially a more orderly and justified society.
Basically, fascism is chaos, anarchy is order.
Which is really interesting, because if you ask anybody on the street, they'd probably say the opposite of that. I like that. That's fantastic. And definitely go sub to all of the channels that are linked in the text box in the side here. And I want to thank all of my guests for showing up today. I think that was a very informative debate. And yes, if we do this again, it's going to have to be on something that is very minute, very specific, so we don't trail off topics so much. So thank you
real quick, Aaron.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Just to pose it now with the chat and everything going, we could maybe even do a vote about like one aspect of society. So like, how do we distribute water? How do we distribute, like, how is the police organized? How do we organize a workforce? Just like one specific thing, and maybe like have a list people could vote on, and we could talk about. That's like an idea.
My answer is going to be the same for all of them.
Just as long as that vote doesn't translate to a gun being pointed in my face.
Okay.
Just a thought. We could think about it for a future thing.
My answer is going to be the same for all of those questions.
All right. Well, we'll save your answer for the follow-up video if we do one. So thank you very much for joining me, you guys, Esso and Filthy. It was awesome to talk to you guys again. Radical, it's always a good time. So thank you very much for everybody being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This was good.
Yeah, and definitely check out their links in the comment section. Check them out on Patreon and all of those other good things. And have yourselves a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone. Like and subscribe, yada yada.